The Villa Mondragone rose above the Italian countryside like a forgotten fortress, its Renaissance walls holding secrets accumulated over centuries. Wilfrid Voynich climbed the stone steps in April 1912, sweat dampening his collar despite the spring air. He'd travelled from London on whispers of a rare book collection the Jesuits needed to sell quietly. Money troubles plagued even the Society of Jesus. Before we continue this journey into one of history's greatest mysteries, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Press that like button if you're intrigued already. Write in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing our global community of history enthusiasts. Now, back to that fateful day in Italy. Voynich had learned patience in Siberian exile 20 years earlier when the Russian Empire imprisoned him for revolutionary activities. Books became his obsession during those frozen years. After escaping, he transformed from failed bomber into Europe's most successful rare manuscript dealer. His contacts stretched from Oxford to Constantinople. The Jesuits knew his reputation and his discretion. The college librarian led him through corridors lined with centuries of accumulated volumes. Dust motes swirled in shafts of afternoon light. Most of the collection held little interest. Standard theological texts, outdated astronomy treatises, commentaries on Aristotle that universities no longer wanted. Then the librarian produced a wooden chest from a locked cabinet. Inside lay a manuscript unlike anything Voynich had encountered in 15 years of hunting rare books. The vellum felt wrong in his hands. Too soft, too well preserved for something potentially centuries old. He opened it carefully. The first page showed plants drawn with meticulous detail, but Voynich recognized none of them. Roots spiraled in impossible patterns. Flowers bloomed with too many petals arranged in geometric precision. Leaves grew at angles that defied botanical logic. He turned pages faster. Astronomical charts filled with female figures floating in interconnected pools. Circular diagrams that resembled nothing in medieval cosmology. More plants, each stranger than the last. Then came the text. Dense paragraphs covered every page, written in flowing script that suggested confidence and practice. The alphabet looked vaguely European but matched no language Voynich knew. And he knew dozens. Russian, Polish, English, Latin, Greek, Hebrew. This script danced across the vellum in organised sections with paragraph breaks and apparent structure, yet communicated nothing recognisable. His pulse quickened. Forgeries existed, certainly. He'd exposed several, but forgers copied known styles, created plausible fakes that resembled genuine articles. This resembled nothing. Creating an entire alphabet and filling over 200 pages with consistent text would require obsessive effort for uncertain reward. The illustrations alone represented months of painstaking work. Voynich examined the binding, medieval techniques done with genuine skill. The vellum showed appropriate aging patterns in the margins. Someone had handled this book frequently over many years, wearing the edges smooth. The ink had faded naturally, not through artificial acceleration. Every detail suggested authentic age. A loose paper fell from between the pages. A letter, written in Latin by Johannes Marcus Marci, dated 1666. Voynich's breathing stopped as he translated the elegant script. Marci had been sending this manuscript to Athanasius Kircher, the famous Jesuit scholar in Rome. The letter claimed Emperor Rudolph II of Prague had purchased the book for 600 gold ducats. Marci believed it was written by Roger Bacon. Roger Bacon. The name electrified medieval scholarship like few others. A 13th century Franciscan friar who wrote about flying machines, predicted telescopes and microscopes, experimented with optics and alchemy. Church authorities had imprisoned him for dangerous ideas. Most of his work survived only in fragments. If this manuscript truly came from Bacon, it would rewrite history. Voynich knew the claim needed skepticism, attribution to famous figures' inflated value artificially. Yet the letter appeared genuine, written by a real historical figure to another documented scholar. The 600 ducat price staggered him, equivalent to purchasing a small castle in Rudolph's time. Someone had valued this book extraordinarily highly. He negotiated quietly. The Jesuits wanted discretion more than maximum profit. They needed quick cash without scandal. Voynich agreed to terms that gave him the manuscript along with several other volumes as camouflage. He packed his prize carefully between protective layers. The train journey back to London stretched interminably. Voynich couldn't stop opening the manuscript, studying page after page of incomprehensible text and impossible illustrations. A botanical section showed plant after plant with no correlation to known species. An astronomical section displayed celestial mechanics that matched no medieval cosmological model. A biological section featured elaborate plumbing systems and human figures in ways that suggested technical diagrams rather than decorative art. One section particularly unsettled him. Circular fold-out pages showed interconnected pools with tubes running between them, female figures positioned at specific points throughout the system. Green and blue liquids flowed through channels in patterns that suggested deliberate circulation. Medieval bathhouses sometimes appeared in manuscripts, but never with such engineering precision. This looked less like recreation and more like instruction. Back in London, Voynich began showing the manuscript to experts. Each specialist reacted with initial confidence followed by deepening confusion. Botanists couldn't identify the plants. One suggested several might be New World species, which created immediate problems. The book predated Columbus by decades at minimum. Astronomers found the celestial diagrams baffling, matching neither Ptolemaic nor Copernican systems. Cryptographers attacked the text with every known cipher method from medieval times. Nothing worked. The text refused to yield meaning. Substitution ciphers failed. Transposition methods produced gibberish. Even considering lost languages or constructed scripts led nowhere. The writing showed statistical patterns consistent with natural language. Words repeated with appropriate frequency. Sentence structures varied naturally. Paragraphs flowed with apparent logic, yet no key unlocked it. Voynich photographed pages and distributed copies to scholars across Europe and America. World War I interrupted research, but the manuscript's reputation grew. Cryptographers training for military intelligence tried their skills against it. Linguists analyzed letter frequency. Historians searched archives for any mention of similar texts. The manuscript absorbed every attempt at solution and offered nothing back. Carbon dating wouldn't be invented for decades, so Voynich relied on paleographic analysis and material examination. Experts agreed the vellum, ink, and binding techniques suggested 15th century origin, possibly earlier. The illustration style matched late medieval artistic conventions, though the subject matter defied categorization. Everything about the physical book screamed authenticity, which made the content more disturbing. Someone in medieval Europe had created this elaborate encyclopedia of impossible things, plants that didn't exist, astronomical systems without precedent, technical diagrams depicting processes unknown to that era, all encoded in an unbreakable cipher or unknown language. Voynich spent his remaining years obsessed with the manuscript. He died in 1930 without solving it. His widow Anne continued promoting research until her death in 1960. The manuscript eventually reached Yale University's Beinecke Rare Book Library, where it received the catalogue designation MS 408. But scholars worldwide knew it simply as the Voynich Manuscript, named for the man who'd rescued it from obscurity. High-resolution scans eventually made every page available to anyone with internet access. Thousands of amateur and professional researchers launched their own decryption attempts. Computer scientists fed the text into increasingly sophisticated programs. Linguists applied cutting-edge statistical analysis. Botanists searched global databases for plant matches. The manuscript defeated them all, just as it had defeated every attempt since 1912. Each generation of scholars approached with confidence. Certain modern tools would crack what previous researchers couldn't. Each generation eventually confronted the same unsettling reality. The book appeared genuinely meaningful while refusing to communicate anything comprehensible. The question evolved beyond simple code breaking. Why would someone invest enormous effort creating this elaborate volume? Medieval manuscripts required months or years of labour. Vellum cost dearly. Skilled scribes and artists commanded high wages. Someone had poured resources into this project equivalent to producing several normal books. That investment demanded purpose. Voynich had recognised immediately that this wasn't mere decoration or elaborate hoax. The manuscript radiated intentionality. Every illustration showed precise detail. The text flowed with practiced confidence. Whoever created this had known exactly what they were recording and why it needed protection through encryption. Protection from whom? And what knowledge required such desperate concealment that it remained hidden even centuries later, when the original danger had presumably passed? The manuscript suggested knowledge so dangerous, so revolutionary, that its creator chose permanent obscurity over potential discovery. That April day in 1912 had unleashed not just a puzzle, but a haunting question that refused to fade. What had someone known in medieval Europe that we still couldn't comprehend? The manuscript waited silently in its climate-controlled library case, pages full of secrets that time hadn't dimmed. Somewhere in those impossible plants and cryptic diagrams and endless encoded text lay information worth protecting at any cost. The hunt for answers was only beginning. Oxford smelled of wet stone and wood smoke in 1247, when Roger Bacon arrived to study theology. The university held perhaps 300 students crammed into draughty halls along muddy streets. Most came to memorize Aristotle and argue scholastic points that changed nothing about how the world actually worked. Bacon wanted something entirely different. He'd already spent years in Paris absorbing mathematics and natural philosophy from the best minds in Europe. Arabic texts filtered into Christian universities through Spain and Sicily, carrying knowledge that made Greek learning seem primitive by comparison. Islamic scholars had preserved and expanded upon ancient wisdom, while Europe stumbled through centuries of intellectual darkness. Bacon read everything he could acquire, legal or otherwise. The Church viewed curiosity with deep suspicion. Asking how things worked suggested God's design needed improvement. Experimenting with nature implied dissatisfaction with divine creation. The Dominicans had recently established the Inquisition to root out heretical thinking. Bacon watched them burn books in Paris and understood the stakes of forbidden knowledge. Yet he couldn't stop investigating. Light obsessed him particularly. He ground lenses in secret, studying how glass could bend and focus rays. Ancient texts mentioned burning mirrors that set ships aflame from great distances. Bacon believed he could recreate such devices through understanding refraction and reflection principles. His experiments produced results that terrified witnesses. A properly shaped lens could start fires without flame. This seemed like sorcery. Bacon joined the Franciscan order in 1257, seeking protection and resources for his research. The gambit backfired spectacularly. His new superiors, alarmed by his unconventional methods, forbade him from writing or publishing anything without explicit permission. The order's Minister General Bonaventure considered experimental philosophy dangerously close to magic. Bacon found himself trapped within an organisation designed to constrain exactly the kind of thinking he championed. He worked in secret anyway, hiding his research from fellow friars. A small circle of trusted colleagues helped smuggle materials and share findings. They operated like conspirators because that's precisely what they were. Conspirators against enforced ignorance. Bacon's notes filled with observations about optics, astronomy, alchemy, and mechanics that wouldn't be rediscovered for centuries. He predicted flying machines based on understanding air pressure and wing mechanics. His writings described self-propelled vehicles using principles of stored energy. He outlined telescopes and microscopes decades before their invention. Most dangerously, he argued that experimental verification mattered more than ancient authority. Scripture and Aristotle could both be questioned if observation contradicted them. This position amounted to intellectual suicide in 13th century Europe. Pope Clement IV heard rumours of Bacon's work through intermediary channels. Intrigued rather than alarmed, Clement requested in 1266 that Bacon send him a comprehensive summary of his knowledge. The request came secretly, bypassing Bacon's Franciscan superiors who would never have permitted such communication. Bacon saw his chance. Working frantically, he produced 3 massive volumes in 18 months. The Opus Major stretched to over 500 pages, covering mathematics, optics, experimental methods, alchemy, and moral philosophy. He followed with the Opus Minus and Opus Tertium, each expanding on themes the first volume introduced. Together they represented medieval Europe's most advanced scientific thinking, compiled by one isolated friar working against his own order's prohibitions. Bacon arranged secret transport of the manuscripts to Rome through trusted messengers. He knew the content would seem heretical to many readers. His insistence on experimentation over authority challenged the entire scholastic method. His descriptions of optical devices and mechanical inventions sounded like conjurers' tricks. His alchemical work suggested he dabbled in transmutation. Pope Clement died in 1268 before fully reviewing the texts. Bacon's protection evaporated instantly. Jerome of Ascoli, who'd already clashed with Bacon over philosophical differences, rose through church hierarchy with disturbing speed. By 1274 he became Minister General of the Franciscan Order. By 1288 he ascended to the papacy as Nicholas IV. Throughout this climb, Jerome remembered Bacon's defiance and dangerous ideas. The condemnation came around 1277. Church authorities officially censored Bacon's works, citing suspected novelties. This careful phrasing avoided outright heresy charges while accomplishing the same goal. Bacon faced imprisonment in the Franciscan house in Paris. The order confined him under strict supervision, cutting off access to materials and correspondence. His exact imprisonment length remains unclear. Records suggest roughly 15 years of confinement, though some historians argue for less. What's certain is that Bacon emerged broken, his research scattered or destroyed, his reputation ruined. He died around 1292, possibly in Oxford, leaving behind fragments of knowledge that would take centuries to reconstruct. But here the historical trail splits into disturbing possibilities. Bacon had connections throughout Europe's underground network of experimental philosophers, Jewish scholars, Muslim scientists, Greek Orthodox monks, all communities that preserved knowledge outside Catholic orthodoxy. Some historians documented coded correspondence between Bacon and figures in Constantinople, Cordoba, and Prague. These letters employed ciphers that modern scholars have only partially decoded. One recovered fragment from 1270 mentioned the great work that needed protection beyond conventional encoding. Bacon wrote that certain knowledge couldn't be trusted to simple substitution ciphers. Discovery would mean death not just for him, but for anyone associated with the research. He referenced the universal solvent and perpetual motion of the quintessence, in ways that suggested practical applications rather than theoretical speculation. Medieval alchemy wasn't merely about turning lead into gold. Serious practitioners investigated material properties, chemical reactions, and energy transformations. They sought the philosopher's stone, but that concept encompassed far more than simple transmutation. The stone represented perfect understanding of nature's principles, the ability to heal disease, extend life, and access unlimited power. Bacon's alchemical research went further than most contemporaries. He experimented with distillation, crystallization, and combination of substances in ways that resembled modern chemistry. His notes described creating materials that burned without consuming themselves, liquids that generated heat without fire, and compounds that glowed in darkness. These weren't fantasy. They were proto-scientific observations of phosphorescence, exothermic reactions, and controlled combustion. More intriguingly, several Arabic sources reference a European friar who visited Toledo around 1250, seeking specific texts about the ancient engines. Toledo's libraries held books from Moorish Spain's Golden Age, when Muslim engineers built automated devices, water clocks, and mechanical servants. One manuscript mentioned enormous mills that generated power without wind or water, using the hidden fire within Earth itself. Bacon spent unaccounted months in southern France and Spain during the 1240s. Official records don't explain these absences. He returned with knowledge that surpassed anything available at Paris or Oxford. His subsequent work on optics and mechanics suggested exposure to advanced engineering principles beyond standard medieval understanding. The possibility emerges that Bacon encountered information about geothermal energy systems or early steam power experiments. Ancient sources documented Greek and Roman devices that used heat expansion to create motion. Hero of Alexandria built steam-powered mechanisms in the 1st century. That knowledge hadn't entirely vanished. It lurked in manuscript collections across the Mediterranean. If Bacon accessed such texts and understood their implications, he would have recognized immediately how dangerous the knowledge was. A device generating unlimited power through natural means would revolutionize civilization. It would also destroy existing power structures. The Church controlled medieval Europe partly through monopolizing knowledge and resources. Unlimited energy would shatter that monopoly. Bacon needed absolute security for such information. Simple codes wouldn't suffice against determined enemies. The Inquisition employed skilled cryptographers who could break most ciphers given time. Bacon required something unprecedented, a system so complex, so layered, that decryption would prove nearly impossible without the key. He had the linguistic skill. He'd studied Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, and Aramaic. He understood cipher theory from Arabic cryptographic texts. He possessed artistic ability for creating symbolic diagrams. Most critically, he had motivation, protecting knowledge that could change everything. His imprisonment from 1277 onward presented opportunities as well as constraints. Guards watched him, but medieval supervision remained lax by modern standards. Bacon could still write, still correspond occasionally with trusted contacts. During those confined years, he had time to create something extraordinary, a manuscript that appeared meaningless to casual inspection, but contained revolutionary information to those who understood the key. The timing aligns disturbingly well. Carbon dating of the Voynich Manuscript's vellum suggests creation between 1404 and 1438, over a century after Bacon's death. But Bacon could have written the original text, encoding his dangerous knowledge in a system of his own invention. Trusted followers could have transcribed it onto fresh vellum decades later, preserving the content while replacing deteriorating materials. This practice appeared commonly in medieval manuscript transmission. Important texts were copied repeatedly as physical materials aged. A document originally penned in 1280 might exist only in copies made in 1400, with the original long since crumbled. If Bacon's circle protected his final encoded work, they would have ensured its physical preservation even as the cipher remained unbroken. The alternative explanation seems almost as disturbing. Perhaps Bacon trained students in his methods before imprisonment. Someone else in his network possessed the knowledge and linguistic skills to create the encoded manuscript after his death. This successor would have continued Bacon's work in even deeper secrecy, knowing the first generation had already been crushed. Either scenario suggests that medieval Europe held scientific knowledge far in advance of conventional historical understanding. Bacon's documented achievements, predicting telescopes, describing explosives, outlining experimental method, represent only what survived censorship. His destroyed works might have contained genuinely revolutionary discoveries about energy, mechanics, or natural forces. The Church's violent suppression of Bacon's thinking takes on new significance in this context. Perhaps authorities recognize not just intellectual danger, but practical threat. Knowledge that could destabilize civilization required complete elimination. Yet knowledge, once created, proves nearly impossible to destroy entirely. It hides, transforms, encodes itself in forms that survive even when their creators don't. Bacon died obscure and condemned. His reputation recovered only centuries later when historians recognized his genius. But his most important work might never have reached public awareness. It might have transformed instead into an impossible manuscript, filled with botanical diagrams that encoded chemical processes, astronomical charts that mapped energy flows, and endless text written in a cipher that died with its creator. The knowledge waited, locked away, incomprehensible yet preserved. Somewhere in those pages lay secrets that Roger Bacon considered worth protecting at any cost. The question that haunted Voynich would have made Bacon smile grimly. What knowledge mattered so much that it needed hiding forever? The answer might still be hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. Prague transformed into Europe's occult capital under Rudolf II's reign beginning in 1576. The Habsburg Emperor cared nothing for conventional rulership and everything for unlocking nature's deepest secrets. He emptied imperial treasuries purchasing manuscripts, hiring alchemists, and assembling the largest collection of mysterious artifacts in Christendom. Gold flowed toward anyone claiming knowledge of transmutation, immortality, or hidden forces. Rudolf's Kunstkammer filled 3 floors of Prague Castle, with wonders both genuine and fraudulent. Egyptian mummies shared space with supposed unicorn horns. Automata built by master craftsmen stood beside crystals allegedly channeling celestial power. The emperor spent hours examining each acquisition, convinced that somewhere in this accumulation lay the key to ultimate knowledge. His court attracted the desperate and brilliant in equal measure. Tycho Brahe arrived in 1599, fleeing Denmark after his astronomical observations challenged accepted cosmology. The Danish nobleman built an observatory on Prague's outskirts and mapped stars with unprecedented precision. His assistant, Johannes Kepler, would later use this data to prove planets moved in ellipses rather than perfect circles. But astronomy represented only one thread in Rudolf's web of interests. Edward Kelly appeared in 1584 claiming to transmute base metals into gold. The English conjurer had allegedly discovered the philosopher's stone in an ancient manuscript found in Wales. He demonstrated transmutations before witnesses who swore they'd seen lead become gold. Rudolf granted him estates, titles, and unlimited funding. Kelly's mentor and partner, John Dee, brought even stranger credentials. The Welsh mathematician had served as advisor to Queen Elizabeth I before religious opposition forced his departure from England. Dee possessed one of Europe's largest private libraries, containing over 4,000 volumes on mathematics, astronomy, navigation and occult philosophy. He claimed conversations with angels through crystal gazing produced a new language called Enochian. Dee's angelic alphabet bore disturbing similarities to the Voynich script. Both used flowing characters that suggested linguistic structure without matching known languages. Both organized text into clear paragraphs and sections that implied meaningful content. Dee insisted his alphabet came from supernatural sources, but several scholars noted it resembled encrypted versions of existing languages with additional symbolic elements. The Englishman arrived in Prague in 1584, bringing Kelly and several mysterious manuscripts. Rudolf granted them immediate access to his collections and laboratories. For 2 years they worked in relative secrecy, conducting experiments the emperor witnessed but never fully explained to his court. Then Kelly and Dee quarrelled violently over methods and philosophy. Dee returned to England in 1589, leaving Kelly to continue alone. Kelly's story ended badly. Rudolf eventually imprisoned him for failing to produce gold on demand, and the alchemist died trying to escape in 1598. Yet during his years of freedom, Kelly corresponded with alchemists throughout Europe, sharing techniques and manuscripts. His letters referenced the great work of the friar and the botanical key to perpetual motion. These phrases appeared in multiple sources connected to Rudolf's court. Another figure, Michael Sendivogius, Polish alchemist and entrepreneur, mentioned the encoded herbal in writings from 1604. Sendivogius claimed to possess the Philosopher's Stone and demonstrated transmutations that convinced numerous witnesses, including nobles and scholars. He wrote that true alchemical knowledge required 3 components: the proper substances, the correct process, and the cipher that protects the unworthy from power they cannot control. The manuscript's trail grows clearer through these decades. Court records show Rudolf II purchased an encrypted botanical manuscript for 600 gold ducats around 1586. The price staggered contemporaries, equivalent to roughly 65 kilograms of gold, or enough money to maintain a small army for months. Rudolf didn't make such investments in obvious frauds. He'd been swindled enough to recognize deception. Something about this particular manuscript convinced him of its extraordinary value. Jacobus Horsicki de Tiepanek entered the story around 1608. Born in Bohemia, he studied medicine and botany before becoming Rudolf's personal physician and director of the Imperial Botanical Gardens. Tiepanek signed his name on the manuscript's first page, establishing provenance but revealing nothing about its content. His signature suggested official imperial ownership rather than personal possession. Tiepanek recognized some of the botanical illustrations but couldn't explain most. His own herbal catalogues listed hundreds of plant species from across the known world. Rudolf's gardens contained specimens from Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Yet the manuscript showed flora that matched nothing in Tiepanek's extensive knowledge. Several plants resembled known species but displayed wrong characteristics, incorrect leaf arrangements, impossible root structures, flowers with mathematical precision that nature rarely produced. The physician made careful notes in margins that have since faded to near invisibility. Modern imaging technology has recovered fragments suggesting Tiepanek believed the plants represented something other than literal botany. One reconstructed note mentions stages of the work and symbolic transformation. Another references the green lion and red dragon, standard alchemical terminology for specific chemical processes. This interpretation makes sudden sense of the botanical section. Medieval and Renaissance alchemy used elaborate plant symbolism to encode chemical operations. A root system might represent the first stage of breaking down materials. Flowering could indicate successful combination of elements. Seed pods suggested the final product ready for use. An entire herbal could describe a multi-stage industrial process, while appearing to catalogue impossible vegetation. Rudolph's network extended beyond his immediate court. He corresponded with alchemists, astrologers, and natural philosophers across Europe. Giordano Bruno visited Prague in 1588 before his eventual execution by the Inquisition in 1600. Bruno promoted ideas about infinite universes and the possibility of life on other worlds. He also studied memory systems and encoding methods that could preserve dangerous knowledge. Bruno's memory palace technique involved associating information with visual images, arranged in mental architectural spaces. A trained practitioner could memorize enormous amounts of data by walking through imagined buildings where each room, object, and decoration represented specific knowledge. The technique originated in ancient Greece, but found new application in protecting information from censorship. The Voynich Manuscript structure suggests exactly this kind of memory encoding. Each section, botanical, astronomical, biological, pharmaceutical, could represent different chambers in a mental palace. The illustrations serve as memory anchors, each image triggering recall of specific processes or formulas. The text accompanying each image provides detailed instructions in cipher, but someone trained in the system could reconstruct the knowledge from illustrations alone. This approach would explain why the manuscript resisted conventional decryption. It wasn't primarily a cipher, but a visual mnemonic system with encrypted supplementary text. Breaking the text cipher wouldn't automatically reveal the knowledge without understanding how the images encoded information through symbolic representation. Rudolph's obsession with the manuscript intensified in his final years. Mental illness consumed him after 1600, possibly exacerbated by mercury poisoning from alchemical experiments. He withdrew from governance, letting the empire slide toward the chaos that would explode into the 30 Years' War. Yet he continued studying his mysterious books and artifacts, convinced breakthrough remained just beyond reach. The emperor died in 1612 without solving the manuscript. His collection scattered as his brother Matthias assumed power and sold off Rudolph's accumulations to cover debts. The manuscript passed to Jacobus de Tepanek, who kept it until his own death around 1622. From there it moved to Georg Baresch, a Prague alchemist who spent decades trying to decrypt it. Baresch's letters to the Jesuit scholar Athanasius Kircher in Rome reveal his frustration. He described the manuscript as a sphinx that consumed his time and sanity. Baresch insisted the book contained genuine knowledge rather than fraud, because no deceiver would invest such enormous effort for uncertain profit. He begged Kircher, famous for deciphering Egyptian hieroglyphs, to attempt translation. Kircher expressed interest, but Baresch died in 1662 before sending the manuscript to Rome. His friend Johannes Marcus Marci inherited it and finally shipped it to Kircher with the letter Voynich would discover centuries later. Marci's letter attributed the manuscript to Roger Bacon, based on tradition among Prague's alchemical community. Whether this attribution held truth or represented wishful thinking remained unclear. Kircher never cracked the cipher either. The manuscript eventually entered Jesuit archives where it sat forgotten until Voynich's 1912 discovery. But those centuries in Prague revealed something crucial about the book's nature and purpose. Everyone who examined it seriously, Rudolf, Tepanek, Baresch, Marci, Kircher, believed it contained real knowledge encoded for protection. None dismissed it as meaningless fraud. The manuscript radiated intentionality that convinced even skeptical scholars of its significance. Something worth 600 gold ducats to a Holy Roman Emperor wasn't created as an elaborate joke. The alchemical context provides essential framework for understanding what the manuscript might contain. Renaissance alchemy pursued practical goals, creating medicines, developing industrial chemicals, discovering new materials and energy sources. The mystical language surrounding alchemy often obscured genuinely experimental work. Alchemists experimented with acids that could dissolve gold, created phosphorus that glowed mysteriously, developed alcohol distillation techniques, and discovered numerous chemical reactions. They worked with electricity from static charges and magnetism from lodestones. Some investigated geothermal phenomena, noting hot springs and volcanic activity that suggested vast energy beneath Earth's surface. A manuscript encoding this knowledge would need protection from multiple threats. Religious authorities might condemn it as sorcery. Competing alchemists would steal valuable secrets. Political enemies could use technical knowledge for military advantage. The safest approach involved creating an encryption system so sophisticated that only trained initiates could extract the information. The manuscript's survival through Rudolph's court and beyond suggests a network of protectors who understood its value. They kept it hidden, yet preserved, passed between trusted figures who recognized something worth protecting, even if they couldn't access the content themselves. This pattern of careful custody indicates knowledge considered revolutionary or dangerous. Prague's alchemical underground maintained connections throughout Europe for another century. Practitioners shared information through coded letters, symbolic diagrams, and encrypted manuscripts. They met secretly at fairs and markets, exchanged materials and techniques, warned each other about Inquisition investigations. Within this network, reputation mattered more than official credentials. A manuscript authenticated by Rudolf II and studied by respected figures like Behrisch carried enormous weight. Even if no one could read it, the pedigree alone suggested significance. The book became something like a holy relic for the alchemical community, an object of veneration whose meaning mattered less than its symbolic power. Yet the practical streak in alchemy insisted the manuscript held usable knowledge rather than mere symbolism. Somewhere in those pages lay actual information about chemical processes, energy sources, or natural forces. The challenge involved extracting truth from elaborate protection that had worked too well. The cipher had preserved the knowledge through centuries of danger, but now prevented access even when the original threats had faded. Rudolph's court demonstrated how close medieval and Renaissance thinkers came to genuine breakthroughs. Brahe's astronomical data was precise enough to prove planetary motion. Kepler discovered mathematical laws governing orbits. Dee created navigation techniques that enabled global exploration. These weren't primitive superstitions, but serious scientific work hampered by inadequate theory and religious constraints. The manuscript fit perfectly into this context. Advanced knowledge encoded to survive persecution, preserved by believers who couldn't unlock it, waiting for a time when humanity possessed the framework to understand what it contained. The question haunting everyone from Rudolf to Voynich remained constant. What secret justified such elaborate protection? The answer lay encrypted still, tantalizing and untouchable, just as its creator intended. The Cathedral of Notre Dame rose between 1163 and 1345, lifting stone higher than Romans had dreamed possible. Medieval engineers accomplished this without modern steel, power tools, or mathematical formulas taught in universities today. They possessed knowledge transmitted through guild secrets, master to apprentice training that left almost no written record. When the building traditions died, the knowledge vanished with them. Gothic cathedrals employed acoustic engineering that modern architects struggle to replicate. Chartres Cathedral amplifies a whisper spoken at specific points to audible levels throughout the vast interior. The builders positioned stones and shaped spaces to create harmonic resonances that enhanced liturgical singing without understanding sound wave physics in modern terms. They worked from empirical observation refined across generations. More mysteriously, some cathedrals demonstrate unexplained electrical properties. Lightning strikes hit sacred buildings with unusual frequency, yet medieval engineers incorporated systems that channeled the energy safely into the ground through metal-reinforced spires and hidden conductors. Recent analysis of Chartres uncovered copper networks within the walls following patterns that resemble modern electrical grounding systems. The builders understood something about atmospheric electricity that wouldn't be formally studied until Benjamin Franklin's experiments in the 1750s. Cathedrals featured elaborate metalwork supposedly for decorative purposes, but the specific alloys and placements suggest functional design. Iron mixed with small amounts of carbon created steel with particular electromagnetic properties. Copper and silver decorations might have served as conductors rather than mere ornament. Gothic architecture required immense energy for construction. Quarrying stone, shaping blocks, lifting materials hundreds of feet, and positioning multi-ton elements with precision demanded power sources beyond simple human or animal muscle. Historical records document elaborate crane systems using counterweights and pulleys, but the scale of construction suggests additional mechanisms. Some medieval building sites sat near rivers with sophisticated mill systems. Water wheels generated rotational power that drove saw blades, operated bellows for forges, and powered lifting devices. The most advanced mills incorporated gearing systems that adjusted speed and force for different applications. These weren't primitive technologies, but carefully engineered machines that approached early industrial capabilities. The mystery deepens with structures built far from water sources. Cathedral construction, at inland locations without significant rivers, employed alternative power systems that left minimal archaeological trace. References in guild documents mention the engines without describing them explicitly. Illustrations show crane systems that required force exceeding what conventional counterweights could provide. One possibility involves geothermal energy, known to medieval Europeans through hot springs and volcanic regions. Iceland's early settlers harnessed geothermal heat for bathing and cooking. Italian cities near thermal areas used hot springs for industrial processes. The Romans had built elaborate bath complexes over geothermal sites centuries earlier. Knowledge of tapping underground heat might have persisted through medieval centuries. A geothermal power system would leave little surface evidence once decommissioned. Digging deep shafts, installing heat exchangers, and using thermal expansion to generate mechanical force required only materials available in medieval times. The technology demanded understanding of thermodynamics and engineering, but not modern metallurgy or manufacturing capabilities. Damascus steel production ended in the 18th century, its creation method lost completely. The distinctive wavy patterns and legendary sharpness resulted from carbon nanotube formations within the metal's crystalline structure. Modern metallurgists discovered this only through electron microscopy in the early 2000s. Medieval Syrian smiths created nanomaterials without comprehending molecular-level mechanics. They followed precise recipes involving specific ores, particular forge temperatures, and exact cooling procedures. The process incorporated organic materials, wood of certain species, plant extracts with precise chemical properties that introduced carbon in forms promoting nanotube growth. Small variations in any parameter ruined the result. Master smiths passed knowledge orally to a few apprentices who continued the tradition until disruption broke the chain of transmission. Greek fire burned on water and couldn't be extinguished by conventional means. Byzantine forces used it from the 7th century until roughly 1200, when the formula disappeared. Historical accounts describe a substance that ignited on contact with water, burned intensely, and stuck to surfaces like napalm. Several theories suggest combinations of petroleum, quicklime, sulfur, and other chemicals. But no modern recreation matches the described properties exactly. The Byzantines guarded the secret ferociously. Only the imperial family and a few trusted chemists knew the complete formula. Production occurred in secured facilities under military guard. When Constantinople's power declined and the empire fragmented, the knowledge died with its keepers. No written formula survived, or if it did, later owners destroyed it to prevent the weapon's resurrection. These examples reveal a pattern. Medieval and ancient technologies often exceeded what conventional historical narratives suggest possible for their eras. The knowledge existed in isolated pockets, protected through secrecy, transmitted orally or in heavily encoded forms. When social disruption broke transmission chains, the capabilities vanished. The Antikythera mechanism proves this pattern definitively. Discovered in a Roman-era shipwreck in 1901, the corroded bronze device seemed impossibly complex. X-ray analysis in the 1970s revealed an astronomical calculator of stunning sophistication. The mechanism used dozens of gears to predict solar eclipses, track the Olympic Games cycle, and model the motions of Sun, Moon, and planets. The device dated to roughly 100 BCE, placing it during a period historians characterized as lacking advanced mechanical capabilities. Yet here sat a machine that wouldn't be equalled until medieval astronomical clocks appeared over 1,000 years later. Someone in ancient Greece possessed engineering knowledge and precision manufacturing ability that the historical record insisted didn't exist. The mechanism wasn't unique. Ancient sources mention similar devices built by Archimedes and other inventors. Roman writers describe planetariums and astronomical computers as though they were reasonably common among wealthy collectors. Then the knowledge evaporated. Medieval Europeans couldn't recreate such precision gearing until clockmakers in the 14th century independently redeveloped the necessary techniques. Lost knowledge wasn't confined to the Mediterranean. Baghdad battery artifacts discovered in modern Iraq date to the Parthian period around 200 CE. Clay jars contained iron rods surrounded by copper cylinders and sealed with asphalt. When filled with acidic liquid like wine or vinegar, they generated electrical current. Their purpose remains debated, but the design clearly shows understanding of electrochemical principles. Multiple batteries have been found, suggesting widespread knowledge rather than a single inventor's curiosity. They produced roughly 1 volt each, insufficient for most practical applications individually, but capable of useful output when connected in series. Some researchers propose they powered electroplating operations to apply gold to silver objects, a technique that requires electrical current. The batteries disappeared from the archaeological record after the Sassanid period ended in the 7th century. Islamic scholars who preserved Greek and Roman knowledge seemingly didn't preserve this particular technology. Or perhaps they did, but in encoded forms that modern researchers haven't recognized. Medieval monks created illuminated manuscripts using techniques that remain partially mysterious. Some pigments incorporated compounds requiring chemical processes that shouldn't have been available. Others demonstrate understanding of light refraction and optical effects. Certain decorated pages show patterns that seem deliberately designed to create specific visual impacts through color interaction and geometric arrangement. The most elaborate manuscripts required years of work and represented enormous investments. Monasteries that produced them maintained specialized workshops, with knowledge passed between generations of scribes and illuminators. These scriptoria occasionally branched into other technical areas, particularly in orders that valued manual labor and experimental investigation. Cistercian monasteries became engineering centers during the 12th and 13th centuries. They pioneered hydraulic systems for mills, metallurgy for improved agriculture tools, and architectural innovations. Monks experimented with water management, creating elaborate networks of channels, reservoirs, and drainage systems that transformed landscapes. Some historians argue Cistercians achieved proto-industrial capabilities that wouldn't be matched until the Renaissance. The monasteries maintained libraries with texts in multiple languages. Greek, Arabic, Hebrew, and Latin manuscripts sat side by side containing accumulated knowledge from across the medieval world. Monks who understood several languages could synthesize information from different traditions, combining Arabic chemistry with Greek mechanics and Roman engineering. This synthesis sometimes produced unexpected results. A monk reading both an Arabic text on distillation and a Greek manuscript on pneumatics might recognize connections between the two fields. Combining techniques could create new capabilities that neither tradition described independently. Such innovations might be recorded in personal notebooks or shared only with trusted colleagues within the monastic community. When monasteries faced suppression during the Reformation, their libraries scattered. Henry VII's dissolution of English monasteries between 1536 and 1541 threw thousands of volumes onto the market. Many burned as waste, others vanished into private collections. Continental suppressions during the religious wars of the 16th and 17th centuries similarly dispersed monastic learning. Knowledge that existed in a few copies held by religious houses evaporated when those institutions collapsed. Technical information about energy sources, chemical processes, or mechanical systems might survive only if someone had copied it secretly and hidden it safely. An encoded manuscript would serve this purpose perfectly, preserving information while making it incomprehensible to those who might destroy it as heretical or dangerous. Medieval Europe's relationship with technology was more complex than simple backwardness. Certain fields advanced rapidly while others stagnated. Navigation improved steadily, leading to global exploration. Metallurgy developed sophisticated techniques for both weapons and tools. Architecture achieved astonishing heights literally and figuratively. Yet understanding of these achievements as systematic science remained limited. Practitioners knew what worked through experience, but couldn't always explain why in theoretical terms. A master smith produced excellent steel without understanding carbon content's molecular role. An architect designed acoustically perfect spaces without formal sound wave theory. This empirical approach accumulated impressive practical knowledge while leaving little explanatory record for posterity. The vulnerability of empirical knowledge becomes clear when transmission fails. If no apprentice learned the steel-making process before the master died, the technique vanished. If political upheaval destroyed the guild structure, entire technical traditions could disappear in a generation. Recovery required rediscovering through experimentation what had been known through practice. A manuscript encoding practical techniques for generating or storing energy would represent exactly this kind of vulnerable knowledge. The creator would need to preserve precise details about materials, procedures, and equipment while protecting against discovery by authorities hostile to experimental philosophy. The botanical section might describe plant materials needed for chemical processes. The astronomical section could encode timing for procedures requiring specific conditions. The biological section might detail equipment design using the human figure as a scale reference. This approach would create exactly what the Voynich Manuscript presents: apparently meaningful content organized into clear categories but incomprehensible without the encoding key. The elaborate nature of the encryption suggests the knowledge justified the enormous effort required to create and maintain the manuscript through centuries. Medieval technical knowledge extended further than conventional history acknowledged. The question wasn't whether advanced capabilities existed, but rather how widely they spread and why so much vanished. The answer likely involves a combination of secrecy, suppression, and disrupted transmission. Knowledge protected too well became knowledge lost entirely when the protectors died without passing on the key. The Voynich Manuscript might represent the ultimate example of this phenomenon, information preserved perfectly but inaccessibly, waiting for someone to rediscover both the technical context and the decryption method. Somewhere in those encoded pages could lie descriptions of energy systems or mechanical capabilities that medieval practitioners achieved but couldn't openly share. The secrets remained locked away, just as their creators intended, perhaps too well. William Romain Newbold stared at photographic enlargements of the Voynich manuscript until his eyes burned. The University of Pennsylvania philosophy professor had convinced himself he'd found the breakthrough everyone missed. Microscopic analysis revealed what he believed were tiny markings within the main script, a secondary layer of text invisible to casual inspection. Working through 1921, Newbold developed an elaborate decryption method. He claimed the visible text served as camouflage, while the real message hid in microscopic scratches and pen lifts. His system required multiple stages of transliteration, substitution, and anagram solving. The results stunned colleagues who wanted desperately to believe. Newbold's translation described cellular structures viewed through microscopes, astronomical observations using telescopes, and mechanical devices centuries ahead of their supposed time. One passage allegedly detailed the Andromeda Nebula as a spiral galaxy, knowledge that didn't emerge until modern telescopes in the 1920s. Another described spermatozoa with precision that required microscopic observation. If authentic, Newbold's solution proved Roger Bacon or another medieval genius had achieved scientific breakthroughs lost for centuries. The manuscript would represent the most important historical discovery of the modern era. Newspapers ran breathless stories about the decoded medieval superscientist. Newbold lectured to packed halls at academic conferences. His triumph lasted exactly 3 years. In 1931, a year after Newbold's death, cryptographer John Manley systematically dismantled the entire solution. Manley demonstrated that the microscopic markings were simply cracks in the ink, natural aging of the vellum, and artifacts of parchment preparation. They appeared random because they were random. More devastatingly, Manley showed that Newbold's decryption method could produce any desired result from any input text. The system's flexibility meant it generated meaning rather than extracting it. Newbold had essentially solved an elaborate puzzle of his own creation, seeing patterns that existed only in his interpretation. The manuscript remained as mysterious as ever. The failure traumatized the academic community. Scholars became deeply skeptical of any claimed solution, creating an environment where legitimate breakthroughs might be dismissed alongside crackpot theories. Yet the manuscript continued attracting attention from serious cryptanalysts who recognized something genuinely unusual about its structure. William Friedman approached the problem with credentials that commanded respect. He'd broken Japanese codes during World War II, including the complex purple cipher that protected high-level diplomatic communications. If anyone could crack the Voynich manuscript, Friedman seemed the perfect candidate. He assembled a team of NSA cryptographers in the 1950s to attack the text using early computer analysis. The team applied every classical cipher method known to cryptography. Simple substitution ciphers collapsed quickly under frequency analysis. They didn't match. Polyalphabetic ciphers using multiple substitution alphabets couldn't account for the text's statistical properties. Transposition ciphers that rearranged letter order failed to produce meaningful output. Even complex systems combining multiple encryption methods yielded nothing. Friedman spent decades on the manuscript, convinced it had to be solvable through systematic analysis. His working hypothesis suggested a synthetic language created specifically for the manuscript, possibly based on philosophical language concepts popular in the 17th century. These artificial languages attempted to create logical systems where words related to their meanings through rational structure rather than historical accident. Yet this theory collapsed against the carbon dating results that wouldn't emerge until decades after Friedman's death. The manuscript predated the philosophical language movement by 150 years. If it used a constructed language, someone in the early 15th century had invented linguistic concepts that wouldn't be formally developed until much later. This possibility seemed almost as mysterious as the original puzzle. The advent of computers promised new approaches. In the 1970s, researchers fed the Voynich text into increasingly sophisticated statistical analysis programs. The results created more confusion than clarity. The text showed properties of natural language, appropriate word length distribution, reasonable entropy levels, and statistical patterns matching how real languages behave. But which language? The letter frequency didn't match Latin, the lingua franca of medieval scholarship. It didn't resemble any Romance language, Germanic tongue, or Slavic dialect. Comparison with hundreds of language samples found no close matches. Some properties suggested Asian languages, but medieval European contact with China or Japan couldn't explain how such a text ended up on European vellum with European illustrations. Computational linguists discovered that Voynich text had unusually low entropy compared to most natural languages. Entropy measures unpredictability, how much information each new character or word adds. Natural language shows moderate entropy because patterns exist but variation remains high. The Voynich text's lower entropy suggested either heavy repetition or that each word carried less information than typical language units. This finding sparked new theories. Perhaps the text represented a syllabary rather than an alphabet, where each character stood for a syllable instead of a single sound. Japanese and Korean use such systems successfully. A syllabic script for a European language might create exactly the statistical oddities researchers observed. Several teams attempted reconstructions based on this principle. None succeeded. The syllabary hypothesis couldn't explain certain patterns in the text, particularly how words appeared to be built from discrete parts that combined in limited ways. Natural languages allowed almost infinite word construction possibilities. The Voynich script seemed more constrained, suggesting either artificial construction or a highly inflected language with rigid grammatical rules. The 1990s brought neural networks and machine learning to bear on the problem. Researchers trained AI systems on vast corpuses of medieval texts, then exposed them to the Voynich manuscript expecting pattern recognition would identify the underlying language or cipher. The AIs recognized that the text wasn't random noise. It definitely contained structure and organization. But the structure matched nothing in their training data. The neural networks essentially shrugged digitally, unable to classify the text into any known linguistic family or cipher type. This result was arguably more informative than identifying a specific language would have been. The manuscript employed a system genuinely outside the range of normal medieval texts, supporting the theory that it encoded something requiring exceptional protection. Jorge Stolfi, a Brazilian computer scientist, analyzed the text structure in the early 2000s and identified what he called labels. Certain short text strings appeared consistently next to specific types of illustrations. A particular sequence always accompanied star diagrams. Another showed up near plants with certain root structures. These labels suggested the text related meaningfully to the images rather than being completely independent. If text and image connected logically, the manuscript wasn't merely decorative nonsense. It represented genuine information organized into categories with consistent labeling systems. This finding supported the hypothesis that the book served as a technical manual or encyclopedia, with each section covering different aspects of a unified subject. Breaking the label's meaning might unlock the entire structure. Cryptographer Klaus Schmer approached the manuscript from a different angle in 2017. He compiled a database of unsolved historical ciphers and compared their properties. Many encrypted texts from the 15th through 17th centuries shared characteristics, certain statistical signatures that indicated specific cipher methods popular during those periods. The Voynich Manuscript matched none of them. This suggested either a unique cipher system or something other than classical encryption. Schmee proposed that the text might be a glossolalia, invented speech that follows phonological patterns without carrying semantic meaning. Religious mystics sometimes produce such texts during ecstatic trances. However, the manuscript's length and internal consistency argued against random mystical utterances. Glossolalia doesn't maintain coherent structure across 200 pages. Modern AI attempts using transformer models and deep learning architectures tried again in 2019. These systems could translate between languages without explicit programming, learning patterns through exposure to parallel texts. Researchers hoped the AI might recognize the Voynich text as an encrypted or constructed version of a known language and automatically decode it. The AIs identified Hebrew and Arabic as the most statistically similar languages to the source text. Yet attempting translation using either language produced gibberish. The AI detected surface similarities in letter frequency and word structure, but couldn't extract meaning. This result suggested the manuscript might incorporate elements from Semitic languages, but encrypted them beyond the AI's decryption capabilities. The most unsettling possibility emerged from information theory analysis. Some researchers calculated that if the manuscript's text truly encoded complex technical information about energy systems, chemical processes, or mechanical devices, it might require contextual knowledge we lack entirely. Breaking a cipher reveals the underlying language, but understanding that language requires cultural and technical context. Imagine giving a detailed nuclear physics textbook to a medieval scholar after translating it into Latin. They could read every word yet understand nothing because they lacked the conceptual framework. Knowledge of atoms, radioactivity, electromagnetic theory, and mathematical physics. The Voynich Manuscript might present a similar problem in reverse. We could potentially decrypt the text, but remain unable to comprehend the content without understanding the medieval technical context it assumes. This theory gained support from successful partial decryptions of other historical mysteries. Linear B, the ancient Cretan script, was deciphered in 1952 by showing it represented an archaic form of Greek. Yet many tablets remained incomprehensible because they dealt with religious rituals, administrative procedures, and cultural practices that left no explanatory record. The language was solved, but the meaning stayed obscure. The manuscript's illustrations reinforced this frustrating possibility. The plants looked almost recognizable, suggesting they represented real objects encoded symbolically. The astronomical diagram showed organization and purpose without matching known celestial models. The biological section depicted processes with clear stages and sequences. Everything implied meaning just beyond reach, like trying to remember a forgotten word that hovers at the edge of consciousness. Statistical analysis in 2020 using sophisticated algorithms determined with high confidence that the text wasn't a hoax or meaningless invention. The patterns were too consistent, too similar to natural language, too carefully maintained across hundreds of pages. Someone had written meaningful content using a systematic method. The question remained what content and which method. The manuscript had now defeated cryptographers from multiple generations using progressively sophisticated tools. It survived attempts by hand calculation, mechanical computers, early digital systems, and cutting-edge AI. Each generation approached with confidence that their superior technology would crack what previous attempts couldn't. Each generation eventually joined the long list of failures. This consistent defeat suggested the cipher employed principles or methods outside standard cryptographic practice. Perhaps it combined multiple techniques layered together. Maybe it used a key that couldn't be derived from the text itself, a physical object or memorized system that would need separate transmission. Or possibly it wasn't a cipher at all, but a constructed language so alien to modern linguistic categories that current analysis methods couldn't recognize its structure. The manuscript sat in its library case, pages full of information that stubbornly refused extraction. Every researcher who studied it seriously came away convinced it meant something. The alternative, that someone invested enormous effort creating an elaborate, meaningless fantasy, seemed less plausible than continued failure to find the correct approach. But the correct approach remained elusive, hiding somewhere in the intersection of medieval thought patterns, lost technical knowledge, and encryption methods sophisticated enough to survive into the computer age. The manuscript kept its secrets perfectly, just as its creator intended centuries ago. The question of what those secrets were intensified with each failed attempt to expose them. The cipher held, unbroken, and perhaps unbreakable. The knowledge it protected remained locked away, waiting for someone to ask the right questions or possess the right context. Time hadn't weakened the manuscript's defenses. If anything, increasing distance from its creation made comprehension harder, not easier, as the medieval world's assumptions and knowledge base faded further into obscurity. The botanical section consumes roughly half the manuscript's pages, showing plant after plant in careful detail. Each illustration demonstrates artistic skill and botanical knowledge, roots, stems, leaves, flowers, and seeds rendered with attention to structure and proportion. Yet none match known species exactly. Identification attempts began immediately after Voynich's 1912 discovery. Botanists examined the drawings with optimism, expecting to recognize medieval European flora or perhaps exotic specimens from trade routes. The first plant looked vaguely like a violet, but had too many petals arranged in unnatural symmetry. The second resembled a water lily with impossible root structures. The third defied comparison entirely. Early researchers proposed the plants came from Asia or the Americas, explaining their unfamiliarity to European botanists. This theory collapsed against the manuscript's dating. Carbon analysis placed creation between 1404 and 1438, decades before European exploration reached most exotic regions. Columbus wouldn't sail until 1492. Portuguese navigators hadn't yet rounded Africa. The plants couldn't be New World specimens unless pre-Columbian contact occurred far more extensively than historical records suggested. A few illustrations showed tantalizing partial matches. One plant bore resemblance to sunflowers, which originated in North America and shouldn't appear in European manuscripts before the 16th century. Another might represent prickly pear cactus, also American in origin. Several researchers seized on these identifications as proof of transatlantic contact before Columbus. The Viking settlements in Newfoundland around 1000 CE proved pre-Columbian European presence in the Americas. Perhaps other expeditions followed routes that left no archaeological trace. Basque fishermen might have reached North American waters earlier than recorded. Some historians argued that occasional contact could explain American plant knowledge without requiring sustained exploration. Yet this explanation created more problems than it solved. Why would a manuscript focused on American plants use such elaborate encryption? Why mix potentially American species with flora that matched nothing from any continent? The Viking hypothesis couldn't account for the manuscript's systematic strangeness, or explain why someone would encode botanical knowledge so thoroughly. Arthur Tucker and Rexford Talbot proposed in 2014 that the manuscript originated in New Spain, present-day Mexico, created by an indigenous informant or a Spanish observer recording Aztec medicinal knowledge. They identified numerous plants as Mexican species, including 2 types of morning glory, a wild chili pepper and Mexican cyclamen. Their identification suggested the manuscript might be written in an extinct Nahuatl dialect. This theory explained some unusual features. Aztec botanical knowledge was extensive and sophisticated. Mexican flora included many species unknown in Europe. Indigenous codices used similar illustration styles with plants central to cultural and medical practices. The timing even worked if the manuscript's carbon dating represented the vellum's creation rather than the text's writing. But the theory stumbled on multiple contradictions. The manuscript's illustrations showed European artistic conventions completely absent in indigenous codices. The astronomical section depicted zodiacal imagery from European astrology, rather than Mesoamerican calendrics. Most critically, linguistic analysis found no connection between the Voynich text and any Nahuatl dialect, extinct or living. The superficial plant matches couldn't overcome fundamental structural incompatibilities. Sergio Torresella, an Italian historian of herbals, offered a darker interpretation in the 1990s. He argued the plants were deliberately invented as part of an elaborate fraud. A forger in the late Renaissance created the manuscript to sell to collectors obsessed with mysterious ancient texts. The botanical section showed imaginary plants to prevent identification that would reveal the hoax. This explanation appealed to skeptics tired of increasingly exotic theories. Fraud seemed more plausible than lost continents, suppressed energy technology, or alien intervention. Medieval and Renaissance forgers regularly created fake antiquities. The manuscript's sale to Rudolf II for 600 ducats suggested someone profited handsomely from the deception. Yet the fraud hypothesis faced its own insurmountable obstacles. Forgers wanted quick profit with minimal effort. Creating over 200 pages of elaborate illustrations and text in a consistent invented script represented months or years of painstaking work. The internal consistency, the way plants within sections shared stylistic features, how labels appeared systematically, suggested genuine structure rather than random invention. More tellingly, forgers typically created plausible fakes that resembled authentic materials closely enough to fool buyers. They copied known styles and included recognizable elements. The Voynich manuscript's radical unfamiliarity worked against successful fraud. A fake Aristotle manuscript could sell easily. A book in an unknown language describing impossible plants risked rejection as too obviously fraudulent. Edith Sherwood proposed in 2008 that Leonardo da Vinci created the manuscript as a young artist. She found similarities between the botanical illustrations and Leonardo's known plant drawings. The engineering diagrams in the manuscript's other sections resembled Leonardo's mechanical sketches. The left-handed artist might have invented the script to protect his ideas from theft. Carbon dating eliminated this theory immediately. Leonardo was born in 1452, years after the vellum's creation. Even allowing for old parchment reused by a later artist, Leonardo's documented projects and extensive notebooks showed no connection to the manuscript's style or content. The attribution reflected wishful thinking rather than evidence. The botanical mystery deepened with detailed analysis of individual plants. Specimen 93R showed a flower with 6 petals arranged in perfect hexagonal symmetry. Natural flowers rarely achieved such mathematical precision. Slight variations always appeared. The root system displayed 3 distinct sections spiraling in opposite directions. No known plant combined these features. Specimen 18V depicted what appeared to be a large seed pod splitting to reveal smaller pods inside, each marked with different patterns. The illustration suggested stages in a process rather than literal botanical anatomy. Medieval and Renaissance herbals sometimes showed sequential transformation, indicating how plants change through seasons or how medicines were prepared from raw materials. This observation opened new interpretive possibilities. Perhaps the botanical section didn't catalogue literal plants, but rather encoded chemical or alchemical processes using plant imagery as a symbolic language. Each root structure might represent an initial ingredient. Stem characteristics could indicate mixing methods. Flower patterns might show reaction stages. Seed formations possibly depicted final products. Medieval alchemy used exactly this kind of symbolic encoding. The green lion didn't refer to an actual animal, but represented a specific chemical process. The red king and white queen symbolized substances that combined in alchemical marriage. Entire treatises described elaborate procedures using mythological narratives that meant nothing literally but encoded practical laboratory techniques. If the Voynich botanical section followed similar principles, each plant might represent a complete procedural sequence. The illustrations showed not impossible flora, but impossible to understand chemical engineering using botanical metaphors. This interpretation explained why the plants looked almost recognizable. They were based on real species, but modified to encode additional information through variations in structure. Dana Scott applied this theory systematically in 2016, attempting to decode botanical illustrations as chemical diagrams. She identified potential patterns where root systems represented reactants, central stems showed reaction vessels or conditions, and flowers depicted products. Certain plants appeared in groups that might indicate related procedures or sequential steps in a larger process. Her analysis suggested the manuscript could describe industrial chemistry, large-scale production of substances like acids, alkalis, pigments, or medicines. Medieval and early Renaissance craftsmen created these materials but guarded their methods jealously. Guild secrets protected valuable techniques from competitors. A manuscript encoding an entire chemical industry's processes would be worth protecting elaborately. The theory gained support from examining specific plant features. Several illustrations showed elaborate root systems with multiple branches meeting at central nodes. These resemble distillation apparatus diagrams from later alchemical texts. Other plants displayed hollow stems with visible internal structures that might represent tubing or condensation chambers. The botanical imagery could serve as camouflage for engineering schematics. Jules Janik, a horticultural historian, took a different approach in 2013. He analysed the plants not as individual species, but as idealized representations of plant categories. One might symbolize all medicinal herbs with certain properties. Another could represent poisonous plants generally. The manuscript might be a theoretical herbal, organized by function rather than taxonomy. This interpretation explained the plant's strangeness. They weren't meant to match real species, but rather to embody essential characteristics of plant groups. The exaggerated features, oversized roots, precisely symmetric flowers, impossible leaf arrangements, emphasized key identifying traits. A student learning the system could recognize actual plants by comparing them to the idealized templates. Medieval medicine used similar categorical thinking. Herbs were classified by their humoral properties, hot, cold, wet, dry, rather than biological relationships. A plant's value came from its effects on bodily balance, not its species identity. A manuscript organizing botanical knowledge by medical function might deliberately create composite images combining features from multiple real plants that shared therapeutic properties. Yet this explanation couldn't account for the elaborate encryption. If the manuscript served as a teaching tool, accessibility mattered more than secrecy. Students needed to understand the content, not struggle with impenetrable codes. The categorical interpretation helped explain the strange plants, but not why they appeared in unreadable text. Nicholas Gibbs claimed in 2017 to have solved the botanical section by identifying it as a health manual using abbreviations from medieval Latin. His solution placed each plant within humoral medicine framework, explaining the illustrations as treatment guides for various ailments. The text supposedly abbreviated standard medical phrases known to medieval physicians. Academic researchers demolished this interpretation within days. Gibbs had no credentials in medieval studies, paleography, or linguistics. His proposed abbreviation system couldn't be verified against actual medieval medical texts. Most critically, his method produced contradictory results when applied consistently, and required arbitrary assumptions about which letters represented which abbreviations. The botanical section remained stubbornly mysterious despite centuries of investigation and dozens of theories. Each plant individually defied identification. Collectively, they resisted interpretation as straightforward botany, symbolic alchemy, idealized categories, or abbreviated medicine. The illustrations clearly meant something. The internal consistency and careful execution ruled out random invention. That meaning stayed locked away, protected by the same encryption that secured the text. The plants weren't quite imaginary because they showed too much structure and deliberate variation. They weren't quite real because they matched nothing in nature. They existed in a frustrating middle ground that suggested encoding of information through botanical forms modified to carry additional layers of meaning. Some researchers abandoned attempts at literal interpretation entirely. They proposed the plants might be purely mnemonic devices, visual anchors for remembering complex information unrelated to botany. Medieval memory techniques used architectural and visual systems where images triggered recall of associated knowledge. The manuscript's plants might serve similar function, each illustration prompting trained readers to remember specific procedures, formulas, or concepts. This approach made the botanical section's resistance to conventional identification seem less mysterious. The plants weren't supposed to match reality because they served as memory palace decorations rather than botanical documentation. Their strange features, those impossible roots and mathematical flowers, functioned as distinctive markers making each plant memorable and unique. Yet even this interpretation left crucial questions unanswered. What knowledge did these botanical mnemonics preserve? Who created the system and trained others to use it? Why did this particular memory palace survive in manuscript form when the knowledge it encoded vanished? The plants stood as monuments to lost understanding, carefully drawn guardians of secrets that died with those who knew their true significance. The botanical section refused to surrender its purpose. Each plant sat frozen on its vellum page, roots spreading in deliberate patterns, stems rising with careful proportion, flowers blooming in impossible perfection. They waited patiently for someone to understand what they truly represented. Perhaps actual flora from undocumented sources, perhaps chemical processes symbolically rendered, perhaps memory devices for vanished knowledge, perhaps something else entirely that modern frameworks couldn't grasp. The answer hid somewhere in those carefully inked leaves and elaborately structured roots, as inaccessible as ever. The manuscript's astronomical section occupies folios 67 through 73, displaying circular diagrams that mock conventional celestial mechanics. Medieval astronomy followed strict conventions established by Ptolemy and refined through Islamic scholarship. The Voynich charts matched none of these traditions. Each circular diagram contained concentric rings divided into sections. The divisions didn't follow the standard 12 zodiacal signs or the 28 lunar mansions used in Arabic astronomy. Some circles split into 16 segments, others into 23, still others into irregular divisions that defied systematic counting. The inconsistency suggested either chaotic thinking or a system based on principles completely foreign to known astronomical frameworks. Star-like symbols scattered throughout the diagrams in patterns that resembled no actual constellations. Medieval star charts depicted recognizable patterns: Ursa Major, Orion, the zodiac figures. The Voynich stars clustered in seemingly random arrangements, or followed geometric patterns that implied mathematical organization rather than observed reality. Several diagrams showed symbols connected by lines, creating networks that resembled electrical circuits more than celestial maps. Labels accompanied many symbols using the manuscript's standard script. These text snippets appeared consistently, certain character sequences always near specific diagram types. The repetition suggested systematic labeling of components within a structured system. If the diagrams represented actual astronomical observations, the labels might name stars, planets, or celestial spheres. If they encoded something else, the labels could identify any systematic elements requiring naming. The most puzzling diagrams showed human figures, always female, positioned within or around the circular designs. Standard medieval astronomical illustrations used human forms to represent zodiac signs: Virgo the maiden, Gemini the twins, Aquarius the water-bearer. The Voynich figures bore no resemblance to these conventions. They appeared naked or lightly clothed, often in positions suggesting motion or activity rather than static symbolic representation. One diagram particularly baffled researchers. Folio 68R displayed a circular design divided into radiating sections, each containing a female figure holding what appeared to be a star. The figures faced inward toward a central sun-like symbol. Lines connected each figure to the center and to adjacent figures, creating a web-like pattern. The entire composition suggested a system where elements interacted through defined connections, rather than isolated celestial bodies moving independently. This network structure implied understanding far beyond medieval astronomy. European scholars in the early 15th century still accepted Ptolemaic cosmology, crystalline spheres carrying planets around a stationary Earth. The concept of celestial bodies influencing each other through direct connection would have been revolutionary and possibly heretical. Such ideas wouldn't emerge formally until Newton described gravity's action at a distance centuries later. Some researchers proposed the diagram showed astrological rather than astronomical content. Medieval astrology assigned influences to planetary positions and used elaborate calculation systems to determine these effects. The circular designs might map astrological houses, aspect relationships, or elemental correspondences. The female figures could represent planetary spirits, astrological forces, or symbolic personifications of celestial influences. Yet the diagram structure didn't match standard astrological charts either. Horoscopes use specific angular relationships, conjunctions, oppositions, trines, squares, based on precise degree measurements. The Voynich circles showed no evidence of these careful angular divisions. The figures' positions seemed arbitrary from an astrological perspective, following patterns that made sense only if representing something other than planetary positions. A radical interpretation emerged in the 1990s. What if the astronomical section didn't depict celestial mechanics at all? The circular diagrams might represent terrestrial processes viewed from an organizing perspective that used astronomical metaphors. Medieval natural philosophy often employed celestial analogies to describe earthly phenomena. The spheres could map anything requiring systematic circular organization. This theory gained traction when researchers noticed similarities between the Voynich diagrams and medieval mill schematics. Watermills and windmills use circular motion to transfer power from a central source to multiple work points. The diagram's radiating sections resembled distribution systems where energy flowed from a hub to periphery. The connecting lines might indicate power transmission rather than gravitational attraction. The female figures took on new meaning in this interpretation. Rather than astronomical symbols, they might represent workstations, processing points, or stages in a mechanical sequence. Medieval technical illustrations sometimes used human forms to indicate scale, show operating positions, or mark locations requiring human intervention. A complex mill system or industrial process could be mapped using exactly the visual language the manuscript employed. One folio showed what appeared to be a fold-out diagram, multiple pages meant to unfold into a larger image. When researchers digitally reconstructed the full design, it revealed an enormous circular system with 9 interconnected rings. Each ring contained segments with figures positioned at specific intervals. The entire structure resembled a massive organizational chart or process flow chart more than any celestial map. The 9 rings suggested a layered system where operations occurred at different levels. Medieval cosmology recognized 9 celestial spheres, 7 for the known planets plus fixed stars and primum mobile. But this diagram's rings didn't match that hierarchy. The divisions and relationships followed a logic that remained opaque despite extensive analysis. Stephen Bax, a linguistics professor, identified what he believed were month names in the astronomical section in 2014. He matched certain text sequences to medieval names for months like March and April, based on their positions near diagrams that might represent seasonal or calendar information. If correct, this finding suggested the section tracked time cycles rather than spatial celestial positions. Calendar systems required astronomical observation to determine solstices, equinoxes, and seasonal transitions. Medieval calendars incorporated astronomical data for determining religious feast dates, agricultural timing, and astrological calculations. A sophisticated calendar could require complex diagrams showing how multiple cycles, solar, lunar, seasonal, interacted across years. The Voynich astronomical section might encode a perpetual calendar or astronomical calculating device. Such tools existed in mechanical form: astrolabes, astronomical clocks, planetary computers like the Antikythera mechanism. A manuscript version would provide instructions for calculations or record results from observations. The circular diagrams could map computational processes rather than physical reality. This interpretation aligned with the manuscript's possible connection to Roger Bacon. Bacon studied calendar reform and criticized the Julian calendar's inaccuracies. He calculated that the calendar had drifted from astronomical reality by days and proposed corrections. Such work required detailed astronomical knowledge and computational methods. A manuscript encoding these calculations might appear as elaborate circular diagrams, incomprehensible without the computational key. Yet another theory proposed the astronomical section depicted alchemical time, not clock time or calendar time, but process time. Alchemical operations required precise timing, heating substances for exact durations, cooling at specific rates, combining materials during particular planetary hours, all demanded temporal precision. A system mapping these timing requirements could use circular diagrams where positions indicated duration, sequence, or scheduling. The female figures might represent planets or planetary hours in this scheme. Medieval alchemy assigned each planet ruling authority over specific times. An operation performed during Venus's hour would succeed while the same procedure during Saturn's hour might fail. Tracking these planetary hours required circular diagrams showing planetary sequences and durations. The Voynich astronomical section could serve this function. The diagram's complexity suggested multiple overlapping cycles. Simple planetary hour systems use straightforward repetition, These charts showed intricate relationships between elements at different levels of the circular hierarchy. Perhaps they mapped how multiple timing systems intersected. Planetary hours combined with lunar phases combined with seasonal positions, combined with other cycles to determine optimal moments for specific operations. This level of sophistication would explain the elaborate encryption. Alchemical timing secrets represented valuable proprietary knowledge. A practitioner who understood optimal timing for crucial operations gained enormous advantage over competitors. Such knowledge justified the effort required to create and protect the manuscript. Modern researchers using computer analysis discovered mathematical relationships in the diagram's proportions. The circle's relative sizes, the spacing of divisions and the positioning of elements followed ratios that appeared in medieval mathematics and architecture. Some proportions matched the golden ratio, others reflected Fibonacci sequences, still others corresponded to musical harmonics used in medieval music theory. These mathematical relationships couldn't be coincidental. Someone deliberately constructed the diagrams using precise proportional systems. Whether this mathematical sophistication indicated astronomical calculations, alchemical timing, mechanical engineering, or something else entirely remained unclear. But it definitively proved the astronomical section encoded systematic information rather than decorative fantasy. One particularly intriguing diagram on Folio 69 showed a pattern that resembled modern representations of electromagnetic fields. Curved lines emanated from a central point, created closed loops, and interacted with positioned elements in ways that suggested field effects rather than mechanical connections. Medieval Europeans didn't formally understand electromagnetic theory, but they knew about lodestones and static electricity. Could the diagram map magnetic or electrical phenomena using the visual language of astronomy? This possibility seemed far-fetched until researchers remembered medieval experiments with magnetism. Compass needles responded to magnetic fields in ways that ancient and medieval observers recorded carefully. Some natural philosophers investigated how magnets affected each other, noting attraction and repulsion patterns. A diagram mapping magnetic field interactions might look exactly like the Voynich astronomical charts, circular patterns showing how positioned elements influenced each other through invisible forces. The astronomical section might therefore represent energy field mapping rather than celestial mechanics. The circles could show how forces propagated from sources, how they interacted at different distances, and how positioned elements modified the field structure. This interpretation transformed the female figures into field markers, measuring points, or components placed within the energy system. Such knowledge would be genuinely revolutionary. Medieval scholars theorized about invisible forces, but lacked mathematical frameworks for describing field behaviors. A system mapping energy fields with precision sufficient to enable practical applications could power devices, enable communication, or concentrate forces for useful work. This knowledge would justify extreme protection through elaborate encryption. The astronomical section resisted every attempt at conventional interpretation, while insisting through its internal logic that it meant something systematic and precise. The diagrams weren't random decorations or astrological fantasies. They mapped relationships within a structured system, whether that system represented time, energy, mechanical organization, or something entirely different. The circular forms and radiating patterns suggested centralized systems with power or information flowing from hubs to peripheries. The connecting lines indicated interactions and dependencies between components. The positioned figures marked specific locations within the system, requiring identification. Everything pointed toward engineering or process documentation, rather than observational astronomy. Yet without the key to decode the labels or the context to interpret the relationships, The astronomical section remained as mysterious as the botanical illustrations. The circles rotated endlessly in their vellum containment, patterns suggesting motion frozen in static diagrams. Whatever they mapped, whether stars, seasons, processes, or forces, the information stayed locked within forms that showed their structure while concealing their meaning. The astronomical mystery persisted, encoded in circles within circles, each rotation suggesting answers that never quite materialized into comprehension. The biological or balneological section spans folios 75 through 84, depicting scenes that traditional scholars dismissed as medieval bathhouse illustrations. Female figures, always unclothed or minimally dressed, immerse themselves in pools, basins, and elaborate interconnected waterways. Green and blue liquids flow through pipes connecting the vessels in complex networks that suggest sophisticated hydraulic engineering. At first glance, the interpretation seems straightforward. Medieval bathhouses were common social institutions where people gathered for hygiene, health treatments, and relaxation. Illuminated manuscripts often showed bathing scenes with similar compositions, yet closer examination revealed details that challenged this comfortable explanation. The plumbing systems displayed precision that exceeded typical bathhouse requirements. Pipes branched at specific angles, connected pools in deliberate sequences, and incorporated what appeared to be valves, reservoirs, and control mechanisms. Some pools sat elevated while others positioned lower, suggesting gravity-fed flow systems. The liquid streams showed directional indicators, wavy lines suggesting flow direction through the network. Medieval hydraulic engineering was more sophisticated than popular belief acknowledged. Roman aqueducts demonstrated ancient mastery of water transport. Medieval monasteries built elaborate mill systems with precise water control. Mining operations used hydraulic machinery for drainage and ore processing. The technological capability existed for creating the systems the manuscript depicted. But bathhouses didn't require such complexity. Simple pipes delivering water and drains removing it sufficed for bathing purposes. The Voynich biological section showed something far more elaborate. Networks where liquid circulated through multiple vessels in apparent sequences, with figures positioned at specific points throughout the system. The female figures' positioning seemed deliberate rather than casual. In some diagrams they stood at pipe junctions. Others positioned themselves at what appeared to be flow control points. Still others occupied elevated or lowered positions that suggested role in managing liquid levels. The arrangements implied function rather than mere bathing. One folio showed a particularly complex system with 7 interconnected pools arranged in a circular pattern. Pipes connected each pool to a central reservoir and to adjacent pools. Female figures occupied each pool, and text labels appeared at various points. The entire composition resembled a distillation apparatus or a chemical processing system, more than a bathhouse. Distillation required heating liquid to vaporize it, then cooling the vapor to condense it elsewhere, leaving impurities behind. Medieval alchemists perfected these techniques for creating purified substances, concentrated solutions, and extracted essences. Multiple distillation stages produced progressively purer results. A 7-stage system could achieve remarkable refinement. If the biological section depicted chemical processing rather than bathing, the female figures might serve as scale indicators. Medieval technical illustrations used human forms to show equipment size and positioning. A pool containing a standing figure would be roughly 2 meters deep. Pipes reaching a figure's waist would sit approximately 1 meter high. The human elements provided measurement standards without explicit dimensions. The green liquid appeared throughout the biological section, flowing through pipes and filling certain vessels. Natural bathing waters weren't typically green unless contaminated or treated with specific minerals. Alchemical processes, however, frequently involved green solutions. Copper compounds produced green liquids. Various plant extracts showed green coloration. The green lion of alchemy, vitriol or acidic copper solution, appeared in numerous alchemical texts as a crucial reagent. Blue liquids appeared less frequently, but with equal consistency. Medieval alchemists created blue solutions from various minerals and plant sources. Copper sulfate produced distinctive blue coloring. Certain plant extracts yielded blue dyes. The deliberate color coding suggested the liquids represented specific substances rather than generic water. The pipe network showed multiple connection points, branching structures, and apparent mixing chambers where different streams combined. This arrangement matched chemical synthesis procedures where multiple reagents combine in sequence. Each stage produces an intermediate product that becomes input for the next stage. The final pool in the sequence would contain the ultimate product after all transformations. Several diagrams included what appeared to be heating elements beneath certain pools. Wavy lines under vessels typically indicated fire or heat in medieval technical drawings. Alchemical processes required careful temperature control. Some operations needed gentle warming while others demanded intense heat. A system showing which vessels required heating and which needed cooling would be essential for complex procedures. One folio depicted a vertical arrangement where liquid appeared to rise through a tower structure containing multiple chambers. Female figures positioned at different heights marked chamber levels. This design strongly resembled fractional distillation towers used for separating liquids with different boiling points. The concept wouldn't be formally developed until centuries later, but medieval alchemists understood that careful heating could separate mixed liquids by collecting vapors at different temperatures. The biological section might therefore document an industrial chemical process, large-scale production of some substance requiring multiple processing stages. Medieval industries produced dyes, medicines, acids, alkalis, and other chemicals using techniques that remained trade secrets. A manuscript encoding these procedures would be intensely valuable to competitors and potentially dangerous if it revealed proprietary methods. Pharmaceutical production particularly required elaborate processing. Medieval medicines often involved extracting active compounds from plants through distillation, concentration, and purification. A multi-stage system could extract, refine, and combine various plant essences to create powerful therapeutics. The botanical section might catalogue source plants, while the biological section documented extraction and processing procedures. The pool's interconnected nature suggested recycling and cascading processes. Waste from one stage becomes input for another. Heat generated in one operation warms another vessel. Condensed vapors from distillation return to earlier stages. Efficient industrial chemistry minimized waste and maximized resource use through such integrated designs. Modern chemical plants use exactly this approach, interconnected processing units, where materials flow through sequences of transformations with careful control at each stage. The Voynich biological section could represent a medieval version of this concept, documenting a sophisticated chemical facility using the visual language of pools and plumbing. Some researchers noted that certain diagrams showed figures emerging from pipes or entering vessels through tubes. This imagery suggested material transport rather than people bathing. If the figures represented substances rather than humans, the biological section became a flowchart mapping material movement through a chemical system. Each figure would indicate a substance at a particular processing stage, positioned to show where that material entered, circulated, or exited the system. This interpretation made the text labels crucial. They likely identified specific substances, indicated processing conditions, or provided operational instructions. Without decrypting the labels, researchers couldn't determine which substances or procedures the diagrams represented. But the visual structure clearly showed systematic processing that transformed inputs through multiple stages into different outputs. One particularly enigmatic folio showed what appeared to be a network of vessels connected by tubes, with liquid circulating in a closed loop. No obvious inputs or outputs appeared. The system seemed self-contained. This design suggested a perpetual process or perhaps a demonstration system showing circulation principles. Alternatively, it might represent a theoretical ideal rather than practical apparatus. Medieval philosophers debated perpetual motion's possibility. Some argued that perfect systems could maintain motion indefinitely without external input. Others insisted that friction and resistance inevitably depleted energy. A diagram showing sustained circulation might document actual observations of a system that appeared to maintain flow without visible energy input. Geothermal systems provided one natural example of seemingly perpetual circulation. Hot springs demonstrated continuous flow driven by underground heat. Medieval Europeans knew about these phenomena and utilized hot springs for bathing and heating. A system tapping geothermal energy could maintain circulation indefinitely, as long as underground heat persisted. The biological section might therefore document a geothermal energy extraction system. Hot underground water could circulate through processing vessels, providing both heat for chemical reactions and mechanical power for pumps or mills. The elaborate pipe networks would distribute this energy to multiple workstations. The system would appear perpetual from a surface observer's perspective, since the underground heat source remained invisible. This interpretation aligned with the manuscript's possible connection to energy technology. A geothermal system providing sustained power for chemical processing or mechanical work would be revolutionary. Such technology could enable industrial operations independent of wind or water power. The knowledge would justify the elaborate encryption protecting it from competitors or authorities who might consider it sorcerous. The bathing figures might not represent people at all, but rather personifications of processes or substances. Alchemical texts routinely used human allegories: the chemical wedding, the philosophical child, various kings and queens representing substances in transformation. The Voynich biological section could employ similar symbolic language, where female figures personified stages in a process rather than depicting literal humans. The consistent use of female forms suggested specific symbolic meaning. Medieval alchemy associated feminine imagery with receptivity, transformation, and nurturing processes. Vessels that received, transformed, and produced new substances were considered feminine in symbolic terms. Using female figures to represent these vessels made symbolic sense within alchemical tradition. Yet the figures showed variety in posture, positioning, and activity that implied systematic differentiation. Some stood upright, others reclined. Still others appeared in motion, crawling through tubes or climbing from pools. These variations might indicate different operational states: active processing, passive holding, material transfer, or stage completion. Modern analysis using multispectral imaging revealed previously invisible details in the biological section. Faint lines suggested additional pipe connections that hadn't been fully inked. Traces of erased or modified elements showed the creator revised designs during creation. These corrections indicated working schematics rather than purely decorative illustrations. The artist was documenting a system while refining their understanding of it. Some vessels showed internal details, dividing walls, internal platforms, or suspended elements within the pools. These features suggested that the vessels performed specific functions beyond simple containment. Reaction chambers might include baffles to control flow, platforms to support catalysts, or internal structures to separate phases. The detail level indicated the creator possessed intimate knowledge of the system's requirements. The biological section consumed roughly 40 pages, suggesting the process it documented was extensive and complex. Simple procedures wouldn't require such elaborate documentation. The system involved multiple stages, precise sequencing, careful control, and significant infrastructure. Whatever it produced justified the investment in creating and maintaining this sophisticated operation. The section's position within the manuscript suggested it built on earlier sections' information. The botanical pages might identify raw materials. The astronomical section could specify timing for operations. The biological section then detailed the actual processing system. Together they would constitute a complete industrial manual, from raw materials through processing to finished product. This integrated interpretation made the manuscript's encryption suddenly more urgent. A complete manual for producing something valuable would be intensely desirable to competitors and threatening to established powers. If the product involved energy generation, medicine production, or valuable chemical synthesis, the knowledge could shift economic and political power dramatically. The biological section's systematic nature argued against casual invention or fantasy. Every element showed deliberate design. The pipe networks followed logical patterns. The vessel arrangements made sense for sequential processing. The human elements provided consistent scaling. Someone documented a real system, or at least a carefully designed theoretical one based on practical understanding of hydraulics and chemistry. That system remained encoded, its purpose hidden behind symbolic representations and encrypted text. The pools held their green and blue secrets. The pipes maintained their flow patterns frozen on vellum. The figures occupied their positions eternally, marking stages in a process that once operated but now existed only as mysterious diagrams. The biological section waited like the rest of the manuscript, meaningful, systematic, and perfectly incomprehensible. Its secrets circulated endlessly through channels that showed their structure while concealing their function, just as their creator intended. The WWII library agreed to testing in 2009 after decades of requests from researchers desperate for definitive dating. Removing even tiny samples from rare manuscripts required extraordinary justification. The Voynich Manuscript's importance finally outweighed preservation concerns. The University of Arizona's radiocarbon laboratory received 4 minuscule vellum samples, barely visible fragments that would determine the manuscript's age conclusively. Carbon-14 dating measured radioactive decay in organic materials with precision reaching back thousands of years. Living organisms absorbed carbon-14 from the atmosphere, including a radioactive isotope that decayed at a known rate after death. Measuring remaining carbon-14 revealed how long ago the organism died. For vellum made from animal skin, this meant determining when the animal was slaughtered. The results arrived in February 2011, ending centuries of speculation about the manuscript's age. The vellum dated to 1404, 1438 with 95% confidence. This narrow window placed creation firmly in the early 15th century, eliminating theories about ancient origins, Roger Bacon's direct authorship, or Renaissance-era forgery. Someone had created this mysterious document during a specific 34-year period in medieval Europe. The dating simultaneously answered old questions and created devastating new problems. Roger Bacon died around 1292, over a century before the vellum's creation. He couldn't have written the manuscript directly unless his encoded text was copied onto fresh vellum generations later. This practice wasn't uncommon. Valuable texts were regularly transcribed as physical materials deteriorated. But it added complexity to attribution theories. The 1404-1438 window placed the manuscript during a tumultuous period. The Great Western Schism split the Catholic Church between competing popes. The 100 Years' War devastated France. The Ottoman Empire expanded into Europe, conquering Constantinople in 1453. Plague outbreaks continued sweeping across the continent. Political and religious instability created both danger for unconventional thinkers and opportunities for underground knowledge networks. More problematically, the dating window occurred decades before Columbus reached the Americas in 1492. Those botanical illustrations showing possible sunflowers and other New World plants became chronologically impossible if interpreted literally. European contact with the Americas was documented only through Viking settlements in Newfoundland around 1000 CE, with no evidence of sustained trade or knowledge transfer. Some researchers proposed undocumented pre-Columbian contact. Basque fishermen might have reached North American waters earlier than recorded. Portuguese navigators could have explored west before official expeditions. Chinese treasure fleets under Admiral Zheng had reached Africa in the early 1400s. Perhaps they continued to the Americas without leaving records. Any of these scenarios could explain American plant knowledge in a 1404-1438 manuscript. Yet these hypotheses required extraordinary evidence. Undocumented transoceanic contact would be one of history's greatest discoveries, rivaling the manuscript itself. The botanical illustrations that might suggest American origins remained ambiguous enough that plant experts disagreed about identifications. Building an entire alternative history on uncertain plant matches seemed methodologically unsound. The dating also eliminated Leonardo da Vinci, who was born in 1452. Other Renaissance figures proposed as authors fell outside the timeline. The manuscript originated during the medieval period's final decades, created by someone working within late medieval knowledge frameworks rather than Renaissance innovation. This timeline positioned the manuscript at a crucial transition point. Medieval scholasticism was giving way to early humanist thinking. Alchemical experimentation was becoming more systematic. Astronomical observation was accumulating data that would eventually challenge Ptolemaic cosmology. The period saw intellectual ferment that wouldn't fully flower until later, but was already undermining established orthodoxies. Someone working during 1404-1438 had access to accumulated medieval knowledge, Arabic scientific texts, preserved Greek learning, and centuries of practical experimentation by craftsmen and alchemists. They also worked during a period when religious authorities remained powerful enough to punish heretical ideas aggressively. The combination of available knowledge and institutional danger created perfect conditions for elaborate encryption. The dating raised uncomfortable questions about the ink's age. Carbon dating worked on organic vellum but couldn't directly date inorganic ink. The manuscript's ink contained iron gall compounds typical of medieval writing materials, but these ingredients remained available for centuries. Theoretically, someone could have written on genuinely old vellum decades or even centuries after its preparation. This scenario seemed unlikely for practical reasons. Old vellum became brittle, stained, and difficult to write on. Scribes preferred fresh materials that held ink cleanly. Using century-old vellum would be perverse unless the creator wanted to create a false impression of antiquity, but the manuscript showed no obvious signs of deliberate aging or artificial antiquing that would suggest forgery. The consistency of the ink throughout the manuscript argued against later addition. Chemical analysis showed uniform composition across all pages. The binding appeared contemporary with the vellum. Everything suggested the text was written soon after the vellum's preparation, making the carbon dates reliable indicators of the manuscript's creation period. Researchers now had to reconsider every theory through the lens of early 15th century capabilities and knowledge. What could someone working between 1404 and 1438 have known? what technologies existed in that specific period, which experts or knowledge centres might have produced such a work. Northern Italy emerged as a probable location. The region hosted universities, had strong connections to Islamic learning centres through Mediterranean trade, and maintained communities of scholars investigating natural philosophy. Lombardy and Venetia particularly supported experimental inquiry despite church suspicion. A manuscript created in this region could draw on diverse knowledge sources while operating under enough secrecy to justify elaborate encryption. Prague remained possible despite being further north. Emperor Rudolf II's later interest suggested the manuscript came from circles connected to his alchemical network. Some of these connections might have originated generations earlier. Prague's university attracted scholars from across Europe. The city hosted communities of Hebrew scholars who preserved texts in multiple languages. A Prague origin could explain the manuscript's eventual presence in Rudolf's collection. The dating demolished theories proposing ancient or exotic origins. The manuscript wasn't an Egyptian papyrus disguised as medieval vellum. It didn't represent Aztec knowledge translated into an unknown script. It wasn't a Roman-era medical text preserved through centuries. The carbon dates forced researchers to work within documented medieval European contexts, rather than imagining fantastic alternative histories. This constraint actually strengthened certain theories. The alchemical interpretation made more sense within the 1404-1438 window. Chemical experimentation was advancing rapidly during this period. Practical alchemy was producing genuine results in metallurgy, medicine, and material science, while the theoretical aspects became increasingly elaborate and encoded. A manuscript documenting industrial chemistry would fit perfectly into early 15th century alchemical practice. The astronomical timing theory also gained plausibility. Calendar reform was a live issue in the early 1400s. The Julian calendar's inaccuracies were well known, and various scholars proposed corrections. The Council of Constance, 1414–1418, addressed church reform issues including calendar problems. A manuscript encoding astronomical calculations for calendar correction, or planetary position prediction, would be contemporary with these concerns. The geothermal energy hypothesis became more specific with precise dating. Europe experienced significant volcanic activity during the late medieval period. Iceland's population dealt with eruptions and had developed techniques for utilizing geothermal heat. Italy had active volcanic regions and hot springs used since Roman times. Someone working between 1404 and 1438 could have documented geothermal exploitation methods developed through centuries of empirical observation. Most intriguingly, the dating coincided with the beginning of the printing press era. Johannes Gutenberg began developing movable type printing around 1440, just after the manuscript's vellum date range ended. The manuscript represented the last generation of hand-copied texts before printing revolutionized information distribution. This timing might explain the elaborate encryption. Knowledge that could be copied cheaply through printing needed stronger protection than works that required expensive hand copying. The creator might have anticipated printing's arrival and deliberately encoded information in a form that would resist mass distribution. A printed book in plain language could spread knowledge uncontrollably. An encrypted manuscript remained controllable. Only those with the key could extract meaning, regardless of how many physical copies existed. This possibility suggested the manuscript was created precisely because its era was ending. The transition from manuscript to print culture threatened traditional knowledge control methods. Guild secrets, monastic learning, and alchemical mysteries all face potential exposure through printing. Encoding crucial information in an unbreakable cipher preserved it through the transition while preventing unauthorized access. The carbon dating also provided insight into the manuscript's physical construction. The vellum came from approximately 40 animals based on page count and size. This represented substantial expense in the early 15th century, equivalent to several months' wages for a skilled craftsman. Someone with significant resources commissioned or created the manuscript. This wasn't a poor monk's personal notebook, but a well-funded project. The consistency of the vellum quality throughout the manuscript suggested it was produced over a relatively short period, using materials from a single source. If creation stretched across decades, vellum from different animals at different times would show more variation. The uniformity indicated focused work, possibly by a small team over a few years, rather than a lifetime project by a single individual. Modern dating techniques could potentially narrow the window further. Analyzing vellum samples from different pages might reveal whether all materials were contemporary or if some pages were added later. Ink analysis could determine if all text was written during the same campaign or if additions occurred across years. These refined techniques might eventually pinpoint creation to specific years within the 1404–1438 range. For now, the carbon dating stood as the manuscript's most definitive factual anchor. Regardless of its content, purpose, or authorship, the physical book originated during those 34 years in early 15th century Europe. Every theory about its meaning had to accommodate this constraint. The answer to the Voynich mystery lay somewhere in that narrow historical window. Someone living through those specific decades possessed knowledge they considered important enough to encode elaborately and expensive enough to justify significant resources. They worked within a 15th century context using available materials and technologies. They created something that survived 6 centuries of scrutiny without revealing its secrets. The dating made the mystery more tangible by grounding it in a specific time and place. The manuscript wasn't a timeless enigma floating outside history, but a concrete artifact of a particular historical moment. Understanding that moment, its intellectual currents, technological capabilities, political dangers, and knowledge networks might provide the context needed to finally crack the code. The carbon atoms in the vellum had decayed in their predictable pattern, counting down the centuries from 1404–1438 to the present. They offered the only inarguable fact about the manuscript. When the physical book was created, everything else remained speculation, theory, and tantalizing possibility. The timeline was set. The mystery continued, now constrained by chronology but no less impenetrable for being historically grounded. Greg Kondrak and Bradley Hauer fed the Voynich text into neural networks at the University of Alberta in 2018, armed with algorithms that had successfully translated between dozens of languages. The AI analyzed statistical patterns, identified likely character mappings, and proposed that the underlying language was Hebrew with letters converted through alphagramming, rearranging characters within words according to systematic rules. The system generated sample translations suggesting the manuscript discussed recommendations for the lady, light, air, and fire. These fragments tantalized researchers who saw connections to alchemical elements and natural philosophy. Hebrew made historical sense. Medieval Jewish scholars preserved scientific knowledge, translated Arabic texts, and operated within networks spanning Europe and the Mediterranean. Yet linguists examining the proposed Hebrew translation found it produced mostly nonsense when applied consistently. Cherry-picking individual words generated plausible fragments, but systematic translation yielded gibberish. The AI had identified surface similarities without unlocking genuine meaning. The Hebrew hypothesis joined the growing list of promising approaches that ultimately failed. Amit Ardeh proposed in 2021 that the text was actually Turkish, written in a unique vowel-oriented script. His analysis noted statistical patterns matching Turkic language structure. The timing aligned. The Ottoman Empire was expanding into Europe during the manuscript's creation window. Turkish scholars at Constantinople preserved classical learning and advanced mathematical and astronomical knowledge. A manuscript encoding Turkish scientific knowledge might explain its unfamiliarity to European scholars. This theory faltered on similar grounds. While some patterns matched Turkish structure, comprehensive translation remained impossible. The proposed system couldn't consistently decode the text. Ardit's work highlighted how many languages could show surface similarities to the Voynich script without being the actual source language. The persistent failure of linguistic approaches pushed researchers toward a radical conclusion. Perhaps the manuscript wasn't primarily linguistic at all. The text might function as notation for a technical system where the words represented components, processes, or measurements rather than natural language. Think of chemical formulas, musical notation, or mathematical equations, systems that look like language but operate under entirely different rules. This perspective transformed how researchers interpreted the manuscript structure. The botanical section's text might catalogue chemical properties using symbolic notation. The astronomical section could record measurements and calculations in a specialized numerical system. The biological section might document operational procedures using technical shorthand. Each section would use the same underlying notation system, but apply it to different domains. Gerard Cheshire claimed in 2019 to have identified the language as Proto-Romance, a hypothetical precursor to modern Romance languages spoken in medieval Mediterranean regions. He argued that the manuscript was a medical text created for Maria of Castile, incorporating bathhouse scenes and pharmaceutical preparations. His solution generated immediate publicity and excited coverage in popular media. Academic linguists demolished this theory within days. Proto-Romance wasn't a single language, but a theoretical construct describing multiple evolving dialects. Cheshire's proposed grammar rules contradicted established understanding of Romance language development. His sample translations contained basic errors and inconsistencies. The solution represented wishful thinking rather than rigorous scholarship. The journal that published his paper issued an unprecedented disclaimer before eventually removing it entirely. The repeated failures pushed attention toward the energy hypothesis, the idea that the manuscript documented a power generation or storage system. This theory synthesized observations from multiple sections into a unified technical interpretation. The botanical section described fuel sources or chemical reagents. The astronomical section mapped timing and cycles for operations. The biological section detailed the processing equipment and energy distribution network. Medieval Europeans had access to multiple energy sources. Water wheels and windmills provided mechanical power. Wood and charcoal supplied heat. Animal labor moved loads and operated machinery. Geothermal energy heated buildings in Iceland and Italy. Static electricity and magnetism were known phenomena. Someone synthesizing this knowledge could potentially develop systems more sophisticated than historians typically credit to medieval technology. The Cistercian monasteries demonstrated what organized medieval engineering could achieve. During the 12th and 13th centuries, Cistercian houses built extensive mill networks, hydraulic systems, and metallurgical facilities that approached proto-industrial scale. They operated forges, tanneries, breweries, and workshops powered by carefully engineered water systems. Their capabilities exceeded what most people associate with medieval technology. A manuscript documenting advanced energy technology would necessarily use elaborate encoding. Such knowledge threatened multiple powerful interests. Religious authorities might view it as sorcerous interference with divine order. Guildmasters would want to protect profitable secrets from competitors. Political rulers couldn't risk revolutionary technology falling into enemy hands. The creator would need security beyond simple ciphers. The energy hypothesis explains several otherwise puzzling features. The manuscript sections would represent different aspects of a unified system: fuel sources, timing mechanisms, processing apparatus, and distribution networks. The elaborate illustrations provided visual documentation that text alone couldn't convey. The consistent use of female figures might represent a symbolic system, where feminine imagery encoded specific technical concepts. Geothermal energy offered the most plausible medieval power source, requiring elaborate documentation. Hot springs and volcanic regions demonstrated that enormous heat existed underground. Romans had exploited geothermal sources for heating baths and buildings. Medieval Icelanders used hot springs for cooking and warmth. The technology existed for drilling deeper and extracting heat more systematically. A geothermal system would require knowledge of geology, hydrology, metallurgy, and thermodynamics. The botanical section might identify plants indicating geothermal activity underground. Certain species thrived in mineral-rich soil near thermal features. The astronomical section could map seasonal variations in underground heat flow. The biological section would document the actual extraction and distribution apparatus, pipes, heat exchangers, and circulation systems. Such a system would provide enormous advantages. Geothermal energy operated continuously regardless of weather, unlike wind or water power. It required no fuel supply like wood or charcoal. Properly designed, it could generate heat for centuries with minimal maintenance. A community possessing this technology would gain significant economic and military advantages over competitors. The manuscript's encryption becomes perfectly rational in this context. Geothermal energy technology couldn't be protected through physical security alone. Too many people would observe the installations and figure out basic principles. But the sophisticated details, optimal drilling depths, pipe configurations, heat exchange designs, and efficiency improvements could be encoded in a manuscript accessible only to trained initiates. Modern geothermal plants use principles available to medieval engineers. Water circulates through underground heat, rises as steam or hot liquid, drives turbines or heat exchangers, then returns below to reheat. Medieval metallurgy could produce adequate pipes. Available materials could withstand the temperatures involved. The main barriers were theoretical understanding and systematic implementation, rather than absolute technological impossibility. Some researchers noted that Iceland's geothermal exploitation dropped off significantly after the 13th century despite earlier sophistication. Perhaps knowledge was lost during social disruptions. A manuscript preserving this knowledge in encoded form might have travelled from Iceland through European scholarly networks, eventually reaching Central Europe where it entered Rudolf Thecker's collection. The energy hypothesis also explained the manuscript's survival and careful preservation. If owners believed it contained revolutionary technical knowledge, they would protect it even without being able to read it. The book's reputation within alchemical and scholarly circles would justify its high purchase price and careful custody across centuries. It would be valuable not despite its illegibility, but because of it, proof that dangerous knowledge remained secured. Alternative energy theories proposed electrochemical systems based on Baghdad battery principles. Medieval craftsmen could construct batteries using copper, iron, and acidic solutions. Connecting multiple batteries in series generated useful voltage. Such systems could power electroplating operations, create electromagnetic effects for demonstrations, or even provide lighting through primitive arc discharge. The green and blue liquids in the biological section might represent different electrolytes with specific electrical properties. The pools could be large-scale battery cells. The connecting pipes would serve as conductors distributing electrical current. The female figures might indicate voltage levels, current flow rates, or connection points in an electrical network. The entire section would document a distributed power system supplying electrical energy to multiple workstations. This interpretation seemed fantastical until researchers remembered that medieval craftsmen did create electrical devices without understanding electricity formally. They generated static charges using friction, observed attraction and repulsion, and even created primitive capacitors using metal sheets and insulating materials. Scaling these phenomena into practical systems wouldn't require modern electromagnetic theory, just careful empirical observation and systematic engineering. The combination of geothermal heat and electrochemical power could explain why the manuscript required such comprehensive documentation. A hybrid system using thermal energy to drive electrochemical processes would be genuinely revolutionary. It would provide both heat for industrial chemistry and electrical current for specialized applications. Medieval metallurgy, medicine, and manufacturing could all benefit from such capabilities. The manuscript structure supported this integrated interpretation. Multiple sections describing different components of a unified energy system would require the organization the book displayed. Someone couldn't simply add new sections randomly. The entire document needed careful planning to maintain internal consistency and cross-references between sections. Modern researchers using thermographic imaging discovered unexpected details in the manuscript's physical structure. Certain pages showed heat retention patterns suggesting they'd been exposed to elevated temperatures during creation. Perhaps the creator worked near the very systems being documented, with heat from operations affecting the writing environment. This physical evidence potentially linked the manuscript directly to actual energy technology, rather than purely theoretical description. The energy hypothesis remained unproven, but gained traction as other theories failed. It provided logical motivation for encryption, explained the manuscript's survival and value, accounted for the unusual subject matter, and aligned with known medieval technological capabilities. Most compellingly, it suggested the manuscript encoded practical knowledge rather than mystical nonsense, information that could theoretically be reconstructed and tested if the encoding was cracked. Whether the encoded knowledge described geothermal extraction, electrochemical power, or some other energy technology, the core insight seemed increasingly solid. The manuscript documented something technical, systematic, and valuable enough to justify extreme protection. That something likely involved power generation or energy manipulation using principles and materials available in the early 15th century. The energy weighted encoded in botanical diagrams and astronomical charts and biological schematics, its nature suggested by the manuscript structure, but its specifics locked behind the unbroken cipher. The creator had succeeded perhaps too well. The knowledge survived but remained inaccessible, preserved perfectly but unusable until someone discovered the key. The Library of Alexandria burned multiple times across centuries, but its greatest tragedy wasn't the flames. Scholars had begun dispersing texts decades before the final destruction, recognizing that concentrated knowledge attracted destruction. Manuscripts scattered into private collections across the Mediterranean, hidden in synagogues, monasteries, and homes of wealthy patrons who understood preservation required secrecy. This pattern repeated throughout history, whenever institutional knowledge centers faced threat. When Romans destroyed the Second Temple in Jerusalem in 70 CE, Jewish scholars fled with texts that would otherwise have vanished. When Muslim armies conquered Persia in the 7th century, Zoroastrian priests smuggled ancient astronomical and mathematical works into India. Knowledge survived through networks of protectors willing to hide what authorities wanted destroyed. Medieval Europe continued this underground tradition. Arabic texts containing Greek philosophy and science entered Christian territories through Spain and Sicily, translated by multilingual scholars working in secret. The Church officially prohibited many classical works as pagan corruptions, yet monasteries quietly maintained copies. Forbidden knowledge moved through channels paralleling official culture, preserved by those who recognized its value despite institutional hostility. The Cathars of southern France developed elaborate theological systems drawing on Gnostic texts the mainstream church had suppressed for centuries. Between the 12th and 14th centuries, Cathar communities flourished in Languedoc, maintaining schools and libraries with manuscripts collected from across the Mediterranean. They possessed texts on natural philosophy, astronomy, and medicine alongside their religious works. The Albigensian Crusade exterminated the Cathars with systematic brutality from 1209 to 1229. The Catholic Church considered their dualist theology dangerous heresy, requiring complete elimination. Crusaders burned Cathar libraries, destroyed their schools, and executed anyone possessing their texts. Yet some manuscripts escaped through advance warning networks. Sympathizers smuggled books into Italy, Spain, and more distant regions where they entered collections far from their origins. These scattered texts carried no clear provenance. Owners removed identifying marks to protect previous custodians. Manuscripts entered new collections as mysterious volumes in unknown hands, their content obscure, but their value recognized by those with eyes to see. The Voynich Manuscript's lack of clear origin story fit perfectly into this pattern of deliberately obscured transmission. The Knights Templar accumulated enormous wealth and power during the Crusades, supposedly through banking and military success. Alternative histories suggest they discovered something in Jerusalem's ruins, texts, artifacts, or knowledge that provided advantages their contemporaries couldn't match. When the order was suppressed in 1307, King Philip of France sought their rumoured treasures and secret knowledge as much as their financial assets. Templar manuscripts allegedly contained engineering techniques, medical knowledge, and navigational information beyond standard medieval understanding. Whether true or legendary, the story demonstrated how people believed dangerous knowledge travelled hidden through military religious orders that operated across Europe and the Middle East. Such organizations could move information as they moved money and people through networks that transcended national boundaries and survived political upheavals. Jewish Kabbalistic traditions encoded mystical and natural philosophical knowledge in symbolic systems that appeared purely religious to outsiders. The Sefer Yetzirah and Zohar described creation through linguistic and mathematical metaphors that could be read as cosmology, physics, or mystical theology depending on interpretation. Kabbalists deliberately layered meaning so that surface readings concealed deeper technical content. This encoding method protected knowledge from both hostile authorities and unworthy students. Roman and later Christian governments periodically persecuted Jewish communities, burning books and destroying centers of learning. Kabbalistic encoding ensured that even if physical texts were destroyed, trained scholars could reconstruct essential content from memory using the symbolic keys. The system prioritized knowledge preservation over accessibility. Medieval Islamic scholars faced similar pressures. The Mutazilites promoted rational investigation and questioned literal Quranic interpretation during the 8th and 9th centuries. When Orthodox theologians gained political power, Mutazilite texts were systematically destroyed. Some works survived only because scholars had encoded philosophical arguments within mathematical treatises, astronomical tables, or medical texts where religious authorities didn't bother looking. Al-Khwarizmi's algebra texts contained more than mathematics. They encoded logical methods and philosophical principles that couldn't be stated explicitly under orthodox Islamic regimes. Avicenna's medical encyclopedias included natural philosophical speculation disguised as anatomical description. The tradition of hiding one subject within another became standard practice for Muslim scholars working under ideological constraints. The Inquisition refined persecution of forbidden knowledge into systematic procedure during the 13th century. Inquisitors didn't just punish heretics, they identified, catalogued, and destroyed texts that promoted unauthorized thinking. They understood that controlling belief required controlling information access. Burning books became as important as burning heretics. This institutional pressure made elaborate encoding essential for survival. A manuscript containing orthodox religious content might circulate freely. One questioning church doctrine would be destroyed and its owner executed. A text that appeared meaningless or decorative might survive through confusion. Authorities couldn't determine if it contained heresy, so they might preserve it while investigating. The Voynich Manuscript's impenetrability became its shield. Several cases documented Inquisition encounters with encoded texts. In 1321, Catalan physician Arnau de Vilanova faced charges of heresy, partly based on alchemical manuscripts using symbolic language. Inquisitors couldn't prove the symbols represented heretical beliefs rather than legitimate chemistry, creating prosecution difficulties. Vilanova died before trial, but the case established that sufficiently obscure encoding could create plausible deniability. Later trials showed authorities learning from this lesson. By the 15th century, inquisitors assumed any heavily encoded text contained heresy, regardless of decipherability. The very act of elaborate encryption became suspicious. This evolution made encoding an increasingly dangerous protection strategy. The shield itself marked the bearer as potentially heretical. The witch hunts of the 15th through 17th centuries targeted not just alleged witches, but also healers, midwives, and folk practitioners who possessed medical and botanical knowledge outside church control. Their recipes, herbal formulas, and treatment methods represented practical empirical knowledge accumulated over generations. Much of this information existed only in oral tradition, or personal notebooks that burned with their owners. Some knowledge survived through deliberate encoding in forms that appeared innocuous. A manuscript describing plants might actually document contraceptives, abortifacients, or psychoactive substances, knowledge the church wanted suppressed. Astronomical tables could encode meeting times and locations for underground networks. Medical texts might contain political codes. The manuscript's ostensible subject often differed from its true content. This practice created profound challenges for later historians. How many seemingly straightforward medieval texts actually encoded hidden content? What percentage of botanical, astronomical, and medical manuscripts served as carriers for suppressed knowledge? The Voynich manuscript might represent just one surviving example of a common practice where most encoded works were either decoded and destroyed or lost without anyone recognizing their true nature. The Rosicrucian manifestos of the early 17th century claimed secret brotherhoods had preserved ancient wisdom through centuries of persecution. Whether the Rosicrucians actually existed remained debated, but their manifestos describe precisely the kind of underground knowledge network that the historical evidence supported. Groups of scholars maintaining forbidden texts, passing them between trusted associates, waiting for times when the knowledge could be safely revealed. The Voynich manuscript's journey through history matched this pattern perfectly. It moved from unknown origins into Prague's alchemical circles, passed between scholars who recognized its importance without understanding its content, survived religious conflicts and political upheavals, and eventually reached institutional safety in a modern library. Each custodian protected it, while hoping someone would eventually unlock its secrets. Francis Bacon proposed in the early 17th century that knowledge should be systematically catalogued and made widely available. His vision of scientific advancement through open communication directly challenged the tradition of encoded secrecy. Yet Bacon himself used ciphers in his personal correspondence and recognized that premature disclosure of certain knowledge could be dangerous. The tension between preservation and accessibility remained unresolved. The transition from manuscript to print culture during the 16th century accelerated knowledge dissemination, while making secrecy harder to maintain. A printed book could be copied cheaply and distributed widely. Authorities could ban books, but enforcement became nearly impossible once texts entered circulation. This new reality made traditional encoding methods simultaneously more urgent and less effective. Perhaps the Voynich Manuscript represented the last gasp of medieval knowledge protection strategies. Created just before printing transformed information distribution, it employed encryption methods suited to a manuscript culture where physical control of objects meant content control. In the emerging print world, such protection would prove inadequate. But for knowledge too dangerous to risk even printed distribution, absolute encoding remained the only option. The manuscript thus embodied centuries of forbidden knowledge tradition, the practice of encoding, hiding, and transmitting information that powerful institutions wanted destroyed. It drew on techniques developed across multiple cultures and refined through generations of persecution. Whether it contained alchemical secrets, energy technology, or something else entirely, it represented humanity's stubborn insistence on preserving knowledge despite official efforts at suppression. That knowledge remained locked within the manuscript, protected perhaps too effectively. The encoding that had preserved it through centuries of danger now prevented access in safer times. The forbidden knowledge tradition had succeeded in its primary goal, survival, while failing in its ultimate purpose of eventual revelation. The manuscript existed in liminal state, neither lost nor accessible, preserved but unusable. The underground networks that once protected such texts had fragmented or disappeared. The keys to interpretation that would have passed master to student had been lost when chains of transmission broke. The manuscript stood alone, orphaned from its tradition, containing secrets that waited for someone to rediscover not just the decryption method, but the entire cultural and intellectual context that would make its content comprehensible. The forbidden knowledge waited still, encoded in pages that survived every threat except irrelevance. Understanding it required not just breaking a cipher, but reconstructing an entire lost world of medieval secret learning. The challenge seemed nearly as impossible as the encryption itself. The Benneker Library digitized every page of the manuscript in high resolution during 2004, making the complete document freely available online. Anyone with internet access could examine the same mysterious pages that had baffled experts for decades. This democratization of access unleashed thousands of amateur researchers alongside professional scholars, each convinced they would spot what others had missed. The crowdsourced approach produced more noise than signal. Amateur cryptographers proposed solutions based on everything from ancient Sumerian to Welsh to constructed philosophical languages. Most theories collapsed under basic scrutiny. Several researchers claimed Native American origins despite the carbon dating. Others insisted the manuscript came from lost Atlantis or alien visitors. The genuine mystery attracted fantasists alongside serious investigators. Yet some amateur contributions proved valuable. Software engineers without linguistics training created digital analysis tools that revealed statistical patterns professionals had overlooked. Artists noticed visual similarities between manuscript illustrations and obscure medieval technical drawings. Botanists identified possible plant matches that earlier researchers had dismissed. The diversity of perspectives generated insights that conventional academic approaches missed. Lisa Fagin Davis, executive director of the Medieval Academy of America, emphasized in 2020 that the manuscript wasn't supernatural or alien. It was a medieval European object requiring medieval European context. This grounding principle eliminated elaborate fantasies while focusing attention on plausible scenarios. Someone in early 15th century Europe created this document using available materials and knowledge. Understanding that historical moment held the key, medieval scholars thought holistically in ways modern academic specialization obscures. They didn't separate astronomy, medicine, botany, chemistry, and theology into distinct disciplines, all knowledge interconnected through divine design. A text about plants naturally included astronomical timing, medical applications, and spiritual significance. This integrated worldview might explain the manuscript's apparent subject matter jumps. The manuscript could represent a unified theory of natural philosophy expressed through multiple lenses. The botanical section showed material substances. The astronomical section mapped temporal and energetic patterns. The biological section demonstrated processes and transformations. Together they described a complete system for understanding and manipulating natural forces. The sections weren't random categories but carefully organized facets of a single conceptual framework. This interpretation suggested researchers had been asking wrong questions. Instead of, "What language is this?" or "What do these plants represent?" the question should be, what unified system requires documentation across botanical, astronomical, and biological domains? The answer might involve something modern science has separated into multiple fields, but medieval thinkers treated as unified. Energy systems fit this description perfectly. Generating, storing, and using power requires understanding fuel sources, timing and cycles, distribution networks, and transformation processes. A comprehensive manual for a medieval energy technology would necessarily cover what appear to modern eyes as disparate topics. The manuscript structure becomes logical rather than mysterious when viewed as integrated technical documentation. Recent computational analysis compared the manuscript's statistical properties to modern technical manuals. Striking similarities emerged. Technical documentation shows lower linguistic entropy than literary texts because precision and consistency matter more than stylistic variety. The same terms repeat frequently. Structures follow predictable patterns. The Voynich text displayed exactly these characteristics. This finding suggested the manuscript functioned as something closer to an instruction manual or reference work than a narrative or descriptive text. The words might be technical terms, measurements, or procedural notations that repeated because they identified specific components or operations. Reading it would require knowing the technical system it documented rather than linguistic translation alone. Physical analysis revealed intriguing details about the manuscript's construction. Quire signatures showed the pages were assembled in their current order from the beginning, rather than being reorganized later. The consistent binding indicated a planned structure, not a collection of disparate materials bound together afterward. Someone designed the manuscript as a unified document with intentional organization from botanical through astronomical to biological sections. Certain pages showed corrections and revisions. The creator had second thoughts about specific illustrations or text passages and modified them during composition. These revisions demonstrated that the manuscript resulted from active composition rather than mechanical copying of an existing text. Someone was documenting something while refining their understanding of it. The most tantalizing clue came from palimpsest analysis using multispectral imaging. Faint traces under the current text suggested the vellum had been scraped clean of previous writing before the Voynich text was added. This practice was common. Vellum was expensive and old texts were often scraped away to reuse materials for new works. But it meant the current text wasn't the vellum's original content. What had been erased? Conventional medieval manuscripts, technical notes, an earlier version of the same encoded material. The traces were too faint for reconstruction, but their existence proved the manuscript's creator had access to older texts and deliberately chose to overwrite them. This decision suggested the new content was considered more valuable or urgent than whatever had been erased. The manuscript's survival across 6 centuries represented its own kind of evidence. Many medieval manuscripts were lost, destroyed, or pulped for materials when their content seemed outdated or unimportant. The Voynich endured because successive owners believed it contained something worth preserving. That belief persisted despite, or because of, its illegibility. The book's mysterious nature became its protection. Modern machine learning approaches trained on the manuscript alongside medieval technical texts from alchemy, astronomy, and medicine produced unexpected results. The AI systems couldn't translate the text, but identified that it statistically resembled certain categories of medieval technical writing more than others. Specifically, it showed similarities to alchemical operation descriptions and astronomical calculation tables. These categories aligned with the energy hypothesis. Alchemical operations involved controlled chemical transformations for producing useful materials. Astronomical calculations tracked cycles and timing for operations requiring specific conditions. Both domains related directly to energy technology. Chemistry provided fuels and reactions, while astronomy determined optimal timing and conditions. The AI analysis suggested the manuscript used technical notation from multiple medieval disciplines combined into a unified system. A reader would need knowledge of alchemy, astronomy, and mechanical engineering to comprehend it. The encoding wasn't purely linguistic, but also conceptual. Understanding required the right mental framework from medieval natural philosophy. This conclusion implied the manuscript couldn't be decoded through linguistic analysis alone. Even successfully translating the text into readable language wouldn't necessarily make it comprehensible without reconstructing the medieval technical knowledge it assumed. Like reading a modern physics textbook without mathematical background, the words might be English, but the meaning remains inaccessible. Several researchers proposed that partial solutions might be achievable even without complete decryption. Identifying technical terms, recognizing numerical notations, or matching illustrations to known medieval devices could extract useful information. The manuscript might yield insights gradually through accumulated partial understanding rather than sudden breakthrough. This patient approach aligned with how many historical mysteries were eventually solved. Linear B wasn't decoded through a single flash of insight, but through years of systematic work identifying patterns, testing hypotheses, and building knowledge incrementally. The Voynich manuscript might require similar perseverance. The possibility remained that the manuscript was genuinely unsolvable without additional information. If it used a cipher requiring a physical key, memorized password, or separate codebook, then no amount of analysis would crack it. The creator might have intentionally designed unbreakable security knowing that lesser encryption would eventually fail. Perfect security meant accepting that the knowledge might die with its protectors. This scenario would explain why the manuscript survived in alchemical collections for centuries. Owners believed it was genuinely meaningful but lacked the key to unlock it. They preserved it hoping someone would eventually provide the missing piece. That hope sustained the manuscript through generations of custodians who never saw their expectations fulfilled. The tragic possibility loomed that humanity had possessed revolutionary knowledge in encoded form for 6 centuries, but would never access it because the encoding worked too well. The creator's security measures succeeded absolutely, protecting the information through all threats, including the eventual death of everyone who knew how to decode it. Perfect security became perfect loss. Yet the manuscript refused to fade into obscurity. Each generation of researchers approached it with renewed determination, convinced modern tools would succeed where previous methods failed. The digitization made global collaboration possible. Computational power continued increasing. New analytical techniques emerged regularly. The possibility of eventual breakthrough remained alive. The energy hypothesis provided testable predictions. If the manuscript documented geothermal or electrochemical systems, then certain technical details should be verifiable against modern physics and engineering. The pipe configurations, heat exchange designs, and process sequences should make sense when interpreted through that lens. Researchers could attempt to identify these technical elements even without decrypting the text. Several teams began this reverse engineering approach. They analyzed the biological section's hydraulic networks using modern fluid dynamic software. They examined the astronomical section's circular diagrams as potential timing mechanisms or energy distribution charts. They studied the botanical illustrations for plants with specific chemical or energetic properties. The goal was extracting technical information through the illustrations even while the text remained impenetrable. Early results showed promise. Some pipe configurations in the biological section demonstrated hydraulic efficiency that would make sense for circulating heated fluids. Certain astronomical diagrams corresponded to gear ratios used in medieval mechanical clocks and mills. The botanical section contained plants known in medieval herbals for properties relevant to chemistry and energy. Resins that burned with high heat, herbs yielding corrosive extracts, specimens producing oils and waxes. These observations couldn't prove the energy hypothesis conclusively, but they suggested it deserved serious consideration alongside linguistic decryption attempts. Perhaps the manuscript's secrets could be extracted through engineering analysis rather than linguistic translation. Understanding what it depicted mattered as much as reading what it said. The Voynich Manuscript sat in its climate-controlled case at Yale, available to anyone who wanted to study it. High-resolution scans allowed examination without risking the physical artifact. Every page had been analysed, photographed, spectroscoped, and digitized. No stone remained unturned in the search for clues. Yet the central mystery persisted. The manuscript represented something genuine. Too much evidence pointed toward authentic medieval origin, systematic structure, and intentional meaning for it to be dismissed as hoax or fantasy. Someone had created it for a reason, encoded specific information deliberately, and expected trained readers to extract that information successfully. The system had simply worked too well, outlasting the context needed to decode it. The answer existed somewhere in the intersection of medieval natural philosophy, lost technical knowledge, and systematic encoding methods. Finding it required not just breaking a cipher, but reconstructing an entire worldview. How people in the early 15th century understood nature, energy, transformation, and knowledge itself. The manuscript was a window into a lost intellectual world that looked strange from modern perspectives. Perhaps that strangeness was the point. The manuscript challenged assumptions about what medieval people knew and how they thought. It suggested capabilities and knowledge that conventional history overlooked or dismissed. It represented possibility, the chance that earlier humans understood things we've forgotten or encoded knowledge in forms we haven't recognized. The hunt continued. Researchers worldwide studied the manuscript using every available tool, testing theories, proposing solutions, and advancing understanding incrementally. The answer remained elusive but not impossible. Somewhere in those pages lay information that someone once considered important enough to protect absolutely. That information waited still, locked behind layers of encryption, illustration, and time. The manuscript refused to surrender easily. It had survived 6 centuries of scrutiny without revealing its core secrets. But it had also survived, which meant the knowledge wasn't entirely lost, merely inaccessible. The difference mattered. What was hidden could potentially be found. The search would continue until someone finally asked the right questions in the right way, armed with the right context to understand what the manuscript had been trying to say all along. The pages turned silently in digital form, their mysteries intact, their secrets preserved perfectly.